Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown, this one in search of the legendary King Arthur. More than just a myth. Yes please, written by Danny. Let's explore. Wait, I think I made a video back in the day on a channel that I used to host called Biographics, and we did like a April Fool's about King Arthur, like pretending he was real. It's a little bit cringe in retrospect, but I think people liked it. Anyway, let's jump in. King Arthur, William Tell, Sinbad the Sailor. Oh, and if you're new here, the format of the show, by the way, Danny writes it, never read it before. It's a cold read, we're going to go in, let's go. The Tooth Fairy, Jesus Christ, Sonic the Hedgehog, so many finely crafted fictional characters have taken on a life of their own, to the extent that many of us wish or truly believe that they live and breathe outside the realms of our imagination. Yeah, do you remember when there was that thing a few years ago where people were reading Harry Potter, like kids, and then they were like, no, I can like transfer into the Harry Potter universe in like some sort of twilight sleep. And there was a whole movement around this, like people basically just thinking that they were going into Harry Potter world. And I'm like, this is bizarre, dude. You got to understand, ain't real. You're not 8. Come on. But there's one name on that list which stands out like a moose on a moped because he might just have some genuine historical backgrounds. It's Jesus. I mean, it kind of is, right? But it's also King Arthur. This like historical Jesus, right? Who like, I think I made a video out of this, who like existed. It's just like historical figure or something, right? All right, just before we continue with today's episode, let's talk about skincare because let's be honest, you've probably been neglecting it like I did before I got today's sponsor, FOREO. Luckily for you, FOREO's got a oh God, it's Valentine's Day real soon. Thank you, FOREO, for reminding me. They've got a Valentine's Day sale that's actually worth paying attention to. Look, and I've been using FOREO devices for a while now. I've got the UFO 3, the Luna, the Bear, also the FAQ 202, which they asked me to show you. But I actually had it at home this weekend because I've enjoyed using it. And I was like, hey, wife, you want to try this out? And she was like, yeah, I'll give that a go. Why not? And then I forgot it. But I do have one. You've seen it before. I enjoy using it. And I mean, I enjoy using it. I use it because it makes me look nice and young despite the fact that I'm rapidly approaching middle age. Look, whether it's deep hydration, lifting, or just making sure your skin doesn't look like it's been through a wind tunnel, these devices do it all. And here's the deal. FOREO's running a rare sale right now with up to 50% off plus an extra 10% off if you use my code DEUN, DEUN 10. Yep. These don't go on sale often, so if you could iron up one of these, this is my long term. This is the first one they ever sent me, the Bear 2. Actually, it's the second one because I have another one at home that I use every day. This one kind of just stays at the office for show and tell. But yeah, these are fantastic things. They're a great gift idea. It's just, you know, if you've been neglecting skincare, it's the way to go. So look, there's a link in the description below. Grab yours, you'll thank me later, or your whoever you gave it to for Valentine's Day will. And now back to today's episode. Granted, the conspicuous name might not be the same for everyone, depending on your perspective. Look, I know Danny's doing the whole like religious thing. Do you believe in like Jesus? And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, like historical figure Jesus, sure. Do I believe that he was magical? No, of course not. That would be ridiculous. And the Tooth Fairy was usually pretty generous to me. But I was referring to Arthur, the early medieval warrior king with a penchant for circular tables, who held off the Saxon invasion of Britain whilst wielding a magic sword, forged a utopian kingdom from the halls of Camelot after ruthlessly hacking all of his enemies to bits, and became an inspirational symbol for chivalry, valour, loyalty, and courtly love after sentencing his own missus to death for getting jiggly with one of his knights. Yeah, I have to say, I don't know if it's embarrassing. I must have been a teenager when I found out that King Arthur wasn't real. I just thought it was like fictionalized history. It was just like, yeah, the Knights of the Round Table and yeah, that was real. It was just, it's just been embellished. But it's like, no, not real. Just a story. I think part of it is because I went to some like museum or whatever when I was a kid. Or I might have been a church and they were like, yeah, this is the original. Or like, I think it was my parents. Maybe my dad just told me, this is the original Knights of the Round Table. And I was like, whoa.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know if it was the museum who was just like making it up or whether my dad was just with me. But for a long time, I believed that this was real history. Not the magical shit, obviously. The ruthless and barbaric man of peace and honor already sounds like a bit of a contradictory soul to me. My own childhood introduction to a contender for one of the most famous and admired rulers of all time was in the form of the classic and deeply wondrous 1938 novel, The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White. Wait, I didn't even realize this was based on a novel. I just thought it was that Disney movie where it's like the spoons are dancing around and he's like, say when? Oh my god, it doesn't haunt me like Dumbo. Dumbo is a terrifying movie. I stand by that. Like, Dumbo scared the out of me as a kid, and I don't want my kids to watch it because it's scary. Dumbo's the one where they get turned into donkeys, right? Is that Dumbo? Or is that Pinocchio? Maybe that's Pinocchio. Okay, Pinocchio's scary. The one where they're like playing billiards and drinking beer, and then they're like, oh, and they turn into donkeys, and I'm like, oh, I don't like it.
Baby, I'm scared.
Later adapted into the 1963 animated movie from Disney, but even as a young kid, I had a few niggling doubts about the historical accuracy of this tale. I could cope with the idea of a scatterbrain wizard teaching his young pupil how to become a good future king by temporarily transforming him to a fish and a badger and a squirrel. Oh my god, I completely forgot that happened. Does that happen? Or is that just in the novel? Obviously, I've not read the book, I've just seen the Disney movie, and I saw it a long time ago. And I could just about accept that a scrawny child could ultimately gain the crown of the kingdom just by casually yanking a sword out from a bit of rock, even though the toughest men of all time had all exerted their effort on the same task without even budging it. But I drew the line at Archimedes, the grumpy, talking pet owl teaching the young Arthur how to read and write. Aside from anything else, Archimedes didn't strike me as the kind of owl gifted with the required patience to be a teacher. Yeah, you know what else? Owls are dumb. Like, you want to talk smart birds? Crows, dude. Crows are smart. They make tools. They remember their enemies. Crows are like... This sounds like it's made up, and it might be. But I heard that crows are as smart as like a 5-year-old. So the other day, there were tons of crows in the park opposite our house. Because they were like... I think they were just laying some new grass seed or whatever. And there were tons of crows everywhere. And my daughter was running around trying to scare them away. She's like, they're gonna poo everywhere. She's like clapping at the trees, and I'm like, oh, you might not want to do that. They're smarter than you. And she's like, what, Dad? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. She's 4. Oh no, she is 5 now, so she's as smart as a crow, sorry. So perhaps it's little wonder that the whole story of King Arthur and his round table fellowship of knights is usually dismissed as nothing more than a fairy tale, which reeks more of hocus pocus than history. British archaeologist Niall Mars famously lamented towards the end of his life in the 1980s that no figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time. Wait, really? So people were like actually looking into this? This is the problem. Like, when you go back far enough, like fiction and non-fiction, it kind of blends because, you know, people in the past were a bit more loose with the old facts when they were writing history. They would need a peer review. Please, I'll just make some shit up. It's just got to be believable. Cough, cough, Herodotus. More recently, comedian, actor, and writer David Mitchell, legend, put it a bit more bluntly in the first words of his 2023 book, Unruly, A History of England's Kings and Queens, in which he states, King Arthur is a lie. But in that case, it's an unusual lie, which was widely believed to be true for many hundreds of years, right up until the point where killjoy historians began examining the facts and pointing out the lack of evidence to support this ridiculous legend. Not everyone got that memo, though. As recently as 2002, King Arthur came 51st in a BBC poll to determine the 100 greatest Britons, which is not bad going for a man who apparently never lived. Why was he on the roster? It's not like you could just write in a name. Can you? What, enough people wrote in King Arthur for him to be ranked 51st? Surely it's just there's a huge list and you get to go through it. In that same list, topped by Winston Churchill, there was another quite bizarre placing for the actor Michael Crawford, who is apparently the 17th greatest Briton. Who is Michael Crawford? I've never heard of you. Positioned on the list as a surprising filling between a brain-scarring Margaret Thatcher and Queen Victoria sandwich. Margaret Thatcher's 16th. Kind of does surprise me. Now, who are you, Michael Crawford? Is this one of these people you're going to recognize his face? Who are you? I don't even recognize your face, Michael. How are you the 16th best Briton ever? Who are you? What have you been in?
Who the hell is this guy?
Known for Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, The Phantom of the Opera, Hello Dolly. What is this? What is this? I don't even know what to say. How's the 16th most famous Briton someone I've never heard of? Just as King Arthur and his chums embarked upon an epic quest to find... And how is he more popular or like the less greater Briton than Queen Victoria? And slightly less impressive than Margaret Thatcher. That's got to be the most controversial entry on the list, right? Just as King Arthur and his chums embarked upon an epic quest to find the Holy Grail, many of his more dedicated followers are today still embarking upon epic quests of their own to locate what they believe to be the genuine locations of his birth, his death, his round table, Camelot, and the Isle of Avalon where he currently rests, awaiting the right time to rise again and claim the British throne. Charlie might have a thing or two to say about that, although I suspect King Arthur might just clinch a public vote. Wait, he's going to rise again? From the dead? What are you talking about? But if there's no truth whatsoever to this mythical monarch, then why was his last name constantly popping up in historical chronicles dating back to at least the 9th century, and why have we never stopped banging on about him ever since? Again, I'm going to put this down to early speculation here in today's episode of historians in the past just being a little bit fast and loose with the old facts. If they were just invented characters, why were the remains of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere buried in a graveyard in Glastonbury for hundreds of years before eventually being moved to a marble tomb in the Abbey? And who was, oh my god, in 100 years we're going to be like, yes, the burial point of all Harry Potter. And who was King Arthur meant to be anyway? A chivalrous English king? A Celtic warlord? A man born of magic? A hopeless romantic? A massive bellend? Or just an honorary title bestowed upon many different people? I know it's already pretty clear that much of the popular narrative can quickly be dismissed as folklore fluff, largely because humans never lived in a Tolkien-style world of dragons and wizards and strange ladies in lakes rising to the surface to hand out free magic swords. I would say it's disappointing, I know, but given my disdain for everything Tolkien, I'm like, nah, I'd rather that there wasn't any magical time of dragons. I find it a bit sad and weird that people just don't like reality so much, which I guess is that's fine, you do you, but that you want to go and live in magical Tolkien world or Harry Potter world. I just find it a bit weird and sad. People are probably going to be like, Simon, it's just role-playing, it's just a bit of fun. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Look, I'm a nerd. I find it a bit sad. That's saying something. I'm the biggest Star Trek fan ever. But have we now gone way too far in the opposite direction by confidently declaring that King Arthur has always been nothing more than pure fiction? And if we strip away the more fantastical elements that have been weaved into the fabric of the legend over the centuries, could we find the bare bones of a very real Arthur? Hop on the back of my pantomime horse as we venture back into the days of old when knights were bold in search of a true story behind the once and future king. Oh my god, pantomimes. I hate pantomimes. It's just been Christmas. And, I don't know, Christmas and pantomimes, they just go hand in hand for some reason. I've told this story before, right? My dad, he hated pantomimes. So, as a kid, never went to see pantomimes. And I was like, that's awesome. And my mum, sadly, she died when I was young. So, she was, didn't really get a say because she was dead. And then, but my dad remarries, and my stepmom is like, you've never seen a pantomime? This is crazy. And I must have been 12, 13 at that point, beyond the age of pantomime. And I go there, my dad's dragged along as well, and we're all sitting there, and I'm like, oh my god, this is so cringe. I just hated it, and I hate it now, and it's stupid, and my kids are never going to see one. I'm like my dad. It's never going to happen. Slippery people. My preparation work for this script involved visiting the storybook village of Tintagel on the Atlantic coast of Cornwall to fully immerse myself in the rugged, windswept sanctuary most famously associated with the birth of King Arthur. Well, thanks for doing all that research, Danny. But if your invoices are anything to judge by, that's where you live, Danny. Don't think I don't see through this, Danny. The visit lasted a little longer than I originally envisioned, clocking up just over 10 years. Well, yes, all right, then I moved here 10 years ago. But I think that's just an example of the dedicated approach I take to my research. Sure. I'll give it to you, Danny. It's an odd place, Tintagel. For starters, it's miles from the nearest McDonald's or KFC. Oh my god. And Uber Eats is just a lifeless screen around these parts. Oh my... No. Somewhere where I can't get whatever I want delivered within about 20 minutes is somewhere I don't want to live. No, Danny. Seriously, a simple fast food treat involves a full-day trip. I wouldn't mind seeing a branch of McDonald's open up in the village, but I think the natives would end up marching in the streets in protests as it would go against the traditional quirky Cornish charm of Tintagel. Well, why not just put it, like you see it in historic buildings in the UK sometimes, or anywhere, where they're like, oh yeah, there's a McDonald's in there. I went to a McDonald's, I think it was in Budapest. It was in this huge palace building. It was near the train station. Anyone know this one? Whoever's editing this, if you can find a picture, look up Budapest McDonald's near train station palatial, and I bet you'll find an image of this. It's crazy. Just shove it in one of the old buildings. So instead we have to make do with dozens of Cornish pasty shops and an endless scroll of businesses and places named after some element of King Arthur's story. A tourist taking a quick hop around the village will find the King Arthur's Arms, Merlin's Cave, King Arthur's Grave. Merlin's Cave. I'm such a child. It's not even, there's not even anything weird there. I just imagine it as Merlin's arsehole. What's wrong with me? Why am I like Merlin's dark cave? Why, Simon? Why even think that? Pendragon Gift Shop, the Camelot Castle Hotel, and Merlin's Crystal, Mineral, and Fossil Museum. But sadly, no sign of Sir Lancelot's lascivious lap dancing club. No, that's Merlin's cave. Is wrong with me? I often think that McDonald's would probably get away with planting a branch right here if they just called it Merlin's McDonald's and served up Camelot stacks, crunchy wizard wands, and Queen Guinevere's tarts. But after having grown up in or near northern towns and cities associated with very real and very grimy things such as steel production, coal mining, armaments manufacturing, and the Chuckle Brothers, it does. Oh yeah, the Chuckle Brothers are northern. No one outside the UK has got any idea who the Chuckle Brothers are. But Chuckle Brothers is weird. It does feel a bit weird to live in a village that sells itself on pure myth and fantasy. If Tintagel is only famous for its association with King Arthur, then skeptics would point out that it's famous for nothing at all. The biggest tourist attraction of all is Tintagel Castle. Whenever I get stopped in the streets by an American or German tourist, nobody else in the world cares about King Arthur, they usually ask me one of three questions. Can you tell me the way to the castle where King Arthur was born? Is there not even a wimpy? Or are you going to clean that up, mate? If I was an annoying little smartass, I could answer the first question by saying, no, I can't tell you the way to the castle where King Arthur was born, because it was actually built hundreds of years after he was supposedly born, which he probably wasn't. I don't know. That sounds like a pretty good response. The person would be like, all right, thanks, dickhead. Moving on. Thankfully, I'm not that kind of guy, so I just tell them how to get there and recommend the best place to buy a steak and Stilton Cornish pasty. That does sound good. I'm getting hungry for lunch. It's 11:20. But they won't really see an awful lot when they get there. It's not so much a castle, but what used to be a castle. You do get to enjoy some epic coastal background scenery, but aside from that, you're just wandering around a largely empty peninsula with a few crumbs from the days of yore scattered around it. It still attracts over 300,000 visitors a year, but I suspect that many of them don't really grasp that nobody today is claiming that the castle was the birthplace of Arthur. However, it is claimed that Arthur may have been born, or at least conceived, somewhere in this rough location, in Merlin's Cave, 700 years before the castle was built. So Tintagel appears to be where the story of King Arthur begins. But before we get to his birth, we should first take a look at the background of the chaotic country into which he had been born. I feel like if you want to drum up tourism for like some random place, like just get some famous fiction author and be like, yo, dude, Dan Brown. If you set your latest, what's his novels called? Those super popular ones about was he an archaeologist or a historian or whatever? The fuck guy who goes looking for the... Oh my god, I remember nothing about Dan Brown. Look, some random famous novelist, just pay them like millions of pounds to like set something in your tiny ass little village and make it sound awesome, and people will go. It began about 13.8 billion years ago with an infinitely hot and dense point of singularity that inflated and stretched to form the ever-expanding... Wow, we're getting a really in-depth episode today, aren't we, Danny? Ever-expanding cosmos that we know today. But let's skip forward a bit to the Roman conquest of Britain. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. We'll be here all forever, Danny. Before the Romans came along, the island, widely known as Albion, was occupied by various Celtic tribes wandering aimlessly around the wilderness like lost lemmings and waiting for somebody to invent tea shops. Yes, the dark days. That all changed after 43 AD when the island was rebranded as Britannia and became a province of the Roman Empire, under which it would remain for about 3.5 centuries. Well, the southern two-thirds of the island anyway, as the Romans never quite managed to fully overcome the stubborn resistance from Celtic tribes in part of Scotland, Wales, and northern England. Well, they are tougher up north. Like us southerners would just roll over and be like, okay, it's fine, you could just have it. Up north they'll be like, you ain't touching my coal. I'm not sure why I gave them that accent. It's not a northern accent at all. I don't even know what it is. But this in turn turned out to be a pretty good development, as on the whole the Romans introduced the primitive island to roads, towns, sewage systems, government, trading networks, culture, language, numerals, and letters. Also, government, better off without it. I don't know. I just find it funny those people are like super anti-government. It's like, yeah, I know. Look, government's not great, but they also do run. You want to run yourself? It's not going to go well, I promise you that. But then the Romans buggered off in 410 AD and pretty much left Britannia up the River Thames without a paddle. The Roman Emperor Honorius had been facing problems of his own in Italy, which had led him to recall all Roman troops from Britannia, leaving the island at the mercy of barbarian raids from the neighbouring Irish, Picts from Scotland, Saxons from Germany. The local town councils begged Emperor Honorius for help, but he wrote a sniffy, dismissive letter back to them in which he declared they should look to their own defences, leading Britannia to withdraw their support for the emperor and effectively become an independent state. Well, of course they did. Why would they be like, oh no, he left, but he's still in charge? Obviously not. He kind of just went there, was like, no, you can rely on us, and then fucked off. But this also led to the beginning of the Dark Ages, in which the country, now largely populated by both indigenous Celtic Britons and Romanized Britons, found themselves under constant attack from their neighbours, whilst the benefits of living under the Roman Empire had largely collapsed. Britain would, of course, ultimately be colonized by the Saxons, or more specifically by several Germanic-speaking tribes, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, arriving from what we'd now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. This didn't happen overnight, and there would be several major battles along the way, including a notable battle at Mount Barden, in which Arthur was said to have played more than a significant role. Ah yes, because he's so real. But it was in the fragmented and tumultuous period in between the end of the Roman rule and the dominance of the new Anglo-Saxon kingdom that Arthur was supposedly born, and this itself raises a few questions about what nationality Arthur would have put down on his passport. Everyone seems keen to lay a claim on Arthur, and just about every region and culture in the UK insists that he was one of them. Whilst he's often portrayed as a thoroughly English king, the earliest references to him pop up in Welsh literature, and the matter is further I just realised that in The Sword and the Stone, the boy is King Arthur, isn't he? I'm like, why are we talking about The Sword and the Stone? I was just going along with it, and I'm like, oh, wait, it's the boy, and that's why he's being taught, because he's King Arthur. Oh my god, I'm so slow sometimes. That is right though, isn't it? And the matter is further complicated by the fact that England and Wales hadn't actually been invented yet. He was certainly meant to be a Briton of some description, but the arguments largely boil down to whether he belonged to one of the Celtic tribes who had resisted Roman invasion, or whether he was himself a Romanized Briton. It's a point that we'll return to later on in this video, but for now, let's head back to Tintagel and grab another pasty as we examine the poor lad's unusual and downright sinister birthday. Wild, wild life. Much of the legend had been laid down as early as 1136 by the Welsh monk Geoffrey of Monmouth in his epic work Historia Regnum Britanniae, or the History of the Kings of Britain. Why did David Mitchell need to write a book? Sounds like we got the comprehensive version in 1136. What are you wasting your time for, David? Why don't you make more Mitchell and Webb, David? David Mitchell? Yeah, Mitchell and Webb. That was the show. Love that show, dude. This was continually expanded upon over the centuries, until we reached the Middle England prose romance Le Morte d'Arthur in 1485, in which pretty much all of the familiar elements of the story are present. I hope that includes that talking owl, but it's a pretty entangled tale which has been heavily tweaked and modified in every fresh retelling with little regard for previously established continuity. If I ain't gonna bet anything on this, it's like historical fairy tales that were then sanitized and turned into Disney movies. There's way more murder and rape. Fairy tales in the past were hardcore, but it's a pretty entangled tale, which has been, I was reading, for some reason, my parents bought my children like a Christmas, like a storybook to read them before bed. And normally sit down, read this storybook. And I sit down and I'm like reading this storybook, looks like any other children's storybook. And then like halfway through, it's like these two kids and it's like, oh, one of them gets sick. And it's like, oh, okay, get sick. And then you turn the page, it's like, oh, they had to go to the hospital. And you turn the page and it's like, oh, they've got cancer. And you're like, what the f*** is happening? I sat down for like a nice story, like, I don't know, about some pom-pom who isn't happy that he keeps winning or doesn't win. But instead I'm having to explain to my 5-year-old what cancer is. Like, what the f***? She's 5. She doesn't need to know about this yet. If she does, we'll explain it to her then. Why am I explaining cancer to my kid at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night? Oh my god, but in the end, the kid survives and everything. And the cancer, like, goes into remission. And I'm like, yeah, but you're going to be living the rest of your life being like, well, I hope that cancer doesn't come back. So in this sense, sorry, back to the story, massive tangent over, which has been heavily tweaked and modified in every fresh retelling. I said that already. So in this sense, it's a bit like trying to make sense of the Highlander movies by watching them in chronological order. Don't think I've ever seen any of the Highlander movies. Wait, is that the one where he chops people's heads off in a parking garage? I feel like I have seen that, but a long time ago. If you're not hugely familiar with the legend of King Arthur, I'll try to stick to the most popular traditional narrative as we dive into his life and death and glorious triumphs and utterly miserable failures. It all begins with his dad, Arthur Pendragon, who briefly became the King of the Britons in the aftermath of independence from the Roman Empire. I'll admit that this is not a very encouraging start, as Pendragon is himself generally held to be a fictional character, but let's not concern ourselves with such minor trivialities at this early stage. There was always going to be a strong chance that the father of a probable mythical character might himself have been a bit mythical. No shit. Pendragon was good drinking buddies for a while with a guy called Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, but there was a problem. Pendragon became completely infatuated with his mate's wife, Ingrain. Oh no, a troubling point which soon came to the Duke of Cornwall's attention. The Duke of Cornwall's the dude with the wife. Uh-oh. Despite the fact that Ingrain was a loyal wife to Gorlois and had no interest whatsoever in Pendragon, Gorlois still decided that the safest option all round would be to lock his wife away in the most impregnable place he could find. Why not just lock the other guy away? Why are you not locking away Pendragon? Oh, okay, he's king. All right, my bad. He's king and the other guy's a duke. So I guess he can't lock the king away. Oh no, so he locks away his wife instead. Just kill the king and become the king. What the impregnable place he could find to stop the king from getting his grubby hands on his missus. I thought they said getting grubby with his missus. Arthur's cave! Well, you can't be too careful, can you? The most impregnable place in Cornwall just happened to be Tintagel Castle, but this can't have been the same castle which now lies in ruins just up the road from me, as when Geoffrey of Monmouth first told us about this in 1136, the castle was still about a century away from being constructed, so we must assume that he was talking about an entirely different structure which had been planted on the peninsula in the distant past. Pendragon was a pretty determined chap, though. Actually, considering that he was supposed to be king, you'd have thought he could have just ordered his men to seize the castle. Yeah, the other guy's just a duke. Be like, yo, get your wife out. Send her around to my house. And no, you can't come. I'm king. Oh god, I told you. This would not be a surprise for like weird stories told 1,000 years ago. There was way more assault. But instead he hatched a more sinister plan with another one of his drinking buddies who just happened to be a wizard named Merlin. Enter the picture, Merlin. Now Merlin is almost as confusing as Arthur, if not more so. We may often think of him as the dotty, gentle wizard depicting in The Sword in the Stone, but earlier versions of the myth portray a much darker spirit who wasn't averse to indulging in some quite dubious behaviour. Is he going to go down the old route of like tricking, what's her face, the Duke's wife into loving the king? Oh, God. F***ing Merlin, you sick. In fact, according to 13th century Romance poetry, Merlin was originally meant to be the Antichrist, but the dastardly plan hatched in the bowels of hell went a bit pear-shaped. A devil had been dispatched to Earth to impregnate a princess with a child that was supposed to grow up into the Antichrist, but the child's mother cottoned onto this and sought help from priests who baptized the child named Merlin and even helped him to use his special powers gifted from hell for good rather than evil. He's going to be like, well, using your powers for good today, Merlin. Well, I'm going to make the Duke's wife want a king. Maybe. Still, Antichrist or not, he was still prone to behaving like a dodgy geezer in some versions of the tale. The plan he hatched with Arthur Pendragon was to temporarily transform the king into the shape of Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, for one night only, so that he could easily gain access to the castle and spend some time with Ingrain, who would be fooled into thinking that he was her real hubby. This is even more up. Is it? But Merlin must have known that it's not like Pendragon was just going to be content with just chatting about the weather over scones and cupcakes. In quite a repulsive turn of events, Pendragon fools Ingrain into bed. Well, it wouldn't be that hard, because he looks exactly like her husband, the Duke. I'm not sure if early medieval law made any provisions for getting savagely manipulated by sickening shape-shifting sorcery, but I suspect not. To further complicate matters, his victim then became pregnant with Pendragon's first son and the rightful heir to the throne, who was named Arthur. However, the birth was hushed up on the advice of Merlin, who took Arthur away to be raised in secret as a peasant by Sir Ector of the Castle Sauvage, which may have been in either Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, or Timbuktu. Funnily enough, this creepy origin story gets completely overlooked in the 1963 Disney movie. I told you there'd be sexual assault. I told you. There always is, and Disney always forget it. Come on, Disney. And later softened versions of the tale suggest that Arthur was simply washed up on the shores of Tintagel one day and rescued by Merlin, who hid and protected him for a while in a cave below the castle. And yes, there is a cave at the base of the peninsula today, which goes by the name of Merlin's Cave, and is said to be the very same place. The tourists go mad for it, even though it's just a perfectly ordinary cave. It recently attracted controversy from locals and historians in 2016 after the owners of the whole site, English Heritage, decided to commission a comic book style carving of Merlin's face, which was engraved into rock near the cave to help get the message across to tourists. Really, English Heritage? That doesn't sound very heritage-like. It sounds tacky, to be honest. This was seen by some as vandalism of a historic site. Well, I don't agree with that. It's vandalism. And it's not a historic site because this isn't real. That's like saying, someone vandalized platform 9 3/4. A historic site. No! And prompting complaints that English Heritage were Disneyfying the whole site. Yeah, I mean, in this case, I kind of agree with those Karens, to be honest. Within just a couple of months, some cheeky scamp had hacked off Merlin's nose in protest. So that just looks a bit silly. I had nothing to do with it. Makes me think that you did, though, Danny. Ulfr Pendragon died shortly after the birth of Arthur, leaving the country without a king for quite some time as several contenders to the throne squabbled fruitlessly over who should wear the crown. Just before he popped his clogs, Pendragon had helpfully thrust a sword into a stone and declared that the first man to remove it was the rightful king of Britain. He was likely acting on the advice of Merlin, who was clearly hatching another plan and had cast some kind of enchantment over the sword. Everyone had pretty much given up hope of ever pulling the sword from the stone by the time a young Arthur got his hands on it. Arthur had been living the life of an ill-treated squire to Sir Ector's bullying son Kay, who was training to be a knight. Can you imagine the guy he'd been bullying turns out to be king, and he's just like, you, off to the gallows. And they're like, that's not a nice act as king. It's like, yeah, I'm king now. I don't have to be nice, yeah. Unaware of his true heritage or even his name, the orphan kid, simply known as Wart, was having a pretty hard time. But his mundane life was spiced up by regular visits from Merlin, who transforms Wart into various animals as part of a lengthy, if slightly baffling tutorial on how to become an all-round top geezer who really knows his onions. You know, what I really missed growing up, and I feel that makes me lack as a man, and just in general, is the fact that I never spent any time as a wolf. It's really a problem in my life, because being transformed into a wolf would have been really useful. What the fuck are we talking about?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I don't know.
War wasn't that great at the Squire-lark, though. When accompanying Kay to a jousting tournament, he suddenly remembers that he'd carelessly left behind Kay's sword, which doesn't go down too well with the trainee knight. Quick-thinking Wart solves the problem when he stumbles across the sword in the stone, and without realizing the significance of what he's doing, he effortlessly pulls out the sword and unwittingly becomes the new king of Britain, after which Merlin explains his real identity. There's often a little confusion over whether this sword in the stone is supposed to be Excalibur, the magical sword King Arthur wielded throughout his countless victories over the years. Wait, in the Disney one, it's definitely like Excalibur is the sword in the stone, right? Right? I guess I'm going to watch Sword in the Stone at some point with my kids, and then I'll be really up to date with all of this lore, which will be great. Looking forward to that. Love watching old children's movies. There's a good reason for that, as some of the versions of the story do suggest this, while others reckon that the sword in the stone was the original version of Excalibur, which snapped fairly early on, prompting Arthur to source an upgraded model. But the most popular way, it was stuck in a stone forever, and all these people tried to remove it, and then it just one day just snaps once it's out of the stone. Please. The most popular versions of the myth explain that Excalibur was an entirely different blade, which was forged on the mysterious Isle of Avalon by an elf who loaded it all up with secret cheat codes. Whereas Arthur, the original sword from the stone himself, Excalibur was given to him by the Lady of the Lake, a fairy nymph enchantress with close connections to Avalon, who is depicted in many different ways across the conflicting works. In this segment of the saga, she just helpfully rises to the surface of a lake or a magic pool to hand over the super sword to Arthur, but only on the condition that he gives it back to her when he's finished with it, which I suppose is fair enough. The difference between the swords does mean that one of the most often quoted passages from the classic comedy film Monty Python and the Holy Grail doesn't really work if you think about it. And I know this is incredibly controversial, but honestly, a lot of Monty Python and the Holy Grail doesn't really work anymore. It just feels so... People have some sort of love relationship with the Monty Python movies. And I'm sure they were funny when they came out, but comedies come a long way and they're just kind of a bit weird now. And not in that kind of good funny way. They're just weird funny. And it's not even that funny. It's those lines spoken by Michael Palin's Dennis the Peasant, who argues, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Hilarious. While some modern versions of the story do simplify the narrative and place all the mystical royal significance on Excalibur, the traditional story suggests that the original sword in the stone had already formed a basis for a system of government long before the Lady of the Lake poked her head out of a pond. King Arthur certainly made good use of Excalibur during his reign, slicing the invading Saxons to bits with his magic throbbing weapon throughout a long string of bloody battles, including the famous showdown at Mount Badon. As a result, the Saxons retreated for several decades, ushering in a new era of peace and tranquility for Arthur's Britain, at least until the Saxons eventually returned with sharper weapons long after Arthur's death to ultimately conquer the land. Yes. Great way to establish peace. Lots and lots of war. I mean, I say that sarcastically, but also World War II was really bad, and there's not been any real major world war since then. It's nearly been 100 years. So maybe lots of fighting does lead to peace. But the peace was good while it lasted. Arthur hooked up with his beloved Guinevere, who became queen, and he set up shop in Camelot, which might be a majestic castle or an entire city, depending on which version you're reading. It's like a choose-your-own-adventure story. It certainly sounds like the kind of place that would have a fish tank wall, a billiards room, a private gym, and a wellness area, a smart fridge, a Wi-Fi-enabled paper shredder, and a vending machine that dispenses truffles. I recently learned that there's all different types of paper shredding. I was just paper shredders. You put your paper in, it goes... and it shreds it. And you're like, is this really safe? Because I feel like if you had enough patience, you could put all the pieces back together. Like in that movie where all those carpet dudes are putting back the carpet weavers are putting back the shredded documents. Is it Argo? That movie where the Iranian embassy movie, right? But there's loads of different types of shredders. There's I think they go from 1, which is where it just cuts it into strips, to a level 7 printer, which is basically where it just turns it into absolutely tiny pieces. And it's this is enough for super top level secrecy government documents. And I'm like, okay, cool, that makes sense. Different printers, different things. So at that point, just burn that, dude. Everyone's got a level 7 shredder. It's called a match, dude. Match in a bucket. Arthur surrounded himself with the bravest and most chivalrous knights in the land, including Sir Galahad. Can you say chivalrous like that, or is it just chivalrous? I feel like chivalrous is also an acceptable pronunciation of chivalrous. I'm not sure why I said it that way, but I feel like I've heard that before. Including Sir Galahad, who was the purest and noblest of them all, and Galahad's dad, Sir Lancelot, who turned out to be either a dashing hero or a sneaky little bag, depending on your perspective. Really? What's perspective? That was kind of is a version of the story, but it's not. It just depends on your own... I don't know anything about Sir Lancelot, to be honest, so I'm just going to stop talking. The king also made sure that all the knights in his court had somewhere nice to sit. The Round Table had been divergently described as either a permanent installation at Camelot or a kind of portable... Oh, wait, I just realised! Isn't Camelot the name of the company that runs the lottery in the UK? The National Lottery is called Camelot. I'm like, where do I recognise the name Camelot from? And I'm like, it's because it's the National Lottery or Lotto by Camelot. It's kind of a badass name for a company, if I'm honest. Or a kind of portable setup that could be erected anywhere that Arthur and his men happen to be passing through, performing their brave deeds. Some say that it was Arthur's idea to commission a carpenter to build the table. Others say that Merlin had a hand in it, whilst others claim that it was a wedding present from Arthur's new in-laws. Can you imagine Arthur's tight with Merlin, right? And he's like, yeah, dude, I'm thinking about, I've got these carpenters, they're going to start working on this table. And Merlin's like, yeah, why don't I just magic that? It's the third time David Mitchell's coming up in today's episode. But in Mitchell and Webb, they've got the BMX Bandit, an angel slayer or whatever. And it's basically they run into situations where it's oh my god, we've got to save that person. And the BMX bandit's I'm going to do a trick up there on my BMX and then rescue them from the thing. And David Mitchell character is Angel Slayer or whatever. It's just yeah, why don't I just summon the angels? And every time he just summons the angels, and I'm See, that's funny, Monty Python. That's what's funny these days. Comedy has evolved, Monty Python. And whilst it's commonly suggested the table could seat around 150 people, there are slightly more bizarre claims that it could seat up to 1,600 guests. It's a fucking massive round table. The person sitting opposite you is like half a mile away. You're like, hello, hello. Can't hear you, can't even see you. But the fundamental idea behind the table was simpler. To avoid any petty squabbles over superiority in rank, the circular table ensured that everyone was sitting on equal footing. Yeah, except, I mean, this is like ancient England. Like, the whole society was based on rank. Like, there's the king, there's those dukes whose wife he's gonna there's like the peasants and the knights and I don't know. Of course there are levels. Just because you make a round table and be like, look, we're all equal. And be like, yeah, maybe you're king, aren't you? And Merlin's a wizard. You don't want to upset him. He'll do some tricks on you. Whilst the idea of everyone being of equal importance is a nice gesture, it still doesn't quite sit right with me when one of them's wearing a crown and making the final call on everything. Exactly. But it's still a cracking setup for a decent game of Monopoly. Yeah, I feel this is like, you know, big companies, they're like, oh, well, we don't really have like a leadership structure. You know, you can just talk to whoever you want. It's a nice open office and all of this stuff, except that it's like, then you're like, oh, well, actually there is a clear leadership structure. And it's like, you have to talk to this person, he talks to that person. And it's like, so why lie? Why say that it's all equal when there's a very clear structure that's almost militaristic in its promotion line? And Arthur and his knights were more than likely sitting around the round table when a proposal was put forward to embark on their most epic mission yet, the quest for the Holy Grail. The origins of the Holy Grail stretch back to the Last Supper when Jesus supposedly drank from a vessel which was later used by one of his followers, Joseph of Arimathea, to catch drops of the dying Christ's blood falling from the cross, transforming the vessel into a holy chalice of incredible power, which everyone has been hunting for ever since. It'd be worth an absolute fortune on eBay. Wait, this one's the one that's supposed to make you live forever, right? I mean, yeah, that's going to be worth a lot. If we were using the Bible as a thoroughly reliable historical document here, and I emphasize the word if, then we'd already be running into a spot of bother with this one, as there's no mention at all of Joseph of Arimathea catching the blood of Christ in the vessel. And whilst the Gospels do briefly mention that Jesus generously passed around a cup of wine during the Last Supper, which he told his guests should be considered as his blood of the covenant, there's no... In the modern perspective, you're like, it's a bit cult-like, isn't it? He's just like, this is my blood, drink it. There's no suggestion that the cup itself was imbued with any supernatural properties, because supernatural properties are not real, and it's never mentioned again in the New Testament. The new backstory behind the Holy Chalice only began to first emerge in later medieval literature when it evolved into the Holy Grail. Oh, okay, I thought those were the same thing, even though we could never quite decide on what exactly it was meant to be. Oh, okay, so I thought the Holy Grail was that, like, Jesus cup thing with the wine in that makes you immortal. It could have been a chalice or a dish or a stone or a heat-changing mug not suitable for the dishwasher. But whatever it was, King Arthur's gallant knights were determined to find it after experiencing a divine mystical vision at Camelot, which definitely had nothing to do with the dodgy mushroom supper that was for dinner. Many of the knights perished in the quest, and the seat reservations at the round table began to rapidly plummet. But it was all a bit of a waste of time in the end, really. I mean, Sir Galahad, along with fellow knights Sir Percival and Sir Bors, did eventually locate the Holy Grail, hidden away in a forgotten castle where it was guarded by the Fisher King, who had been entrusted with this job by the descendants of Joseph of Arimathea. Only Sir Galahad was deemed pure enough to actually view the Holy Grail in all its glory, after which he reckoned there was nothing else worth hanging around for on Earth, and so he prayed to be allowed to ascend to the heavens, a request which was swiftly granted. He's like, well, mission accomplished, nothing else here for me now, might as well kill myself. Weirdo. Sir Percival and Bors buggered off back in the direction of Camelot, feeling a bit dejected by the whole thing. It's like, well, they let one of us in to see it, he saw it, and then he was so in awe of it that he offed himself. Weird ending, wasn't it? As they realized the Holy Grail was meant to be a test of spiritual purity rather than magical object which could be exploited for power and material gain. Disappointing, I know. They were also a bit miffed at the Holy Grail, as it had effectively just vanished in a puff of smoke after Galahad had clocked it, indicating that it was never destined to remain on the earthly plane. Honestly, probably for the better, considering that the only guy who saw it immediately killed himself. Sir Percival decided to give up his place at the Round Table and take a new life as a hermit, leaving Sir Bors to deliver the amazing news to King back in Camelot that they'd found the Holy Grail, but only Sir Galahad had seen it before requesting to drop dead. Now the Grail was gone forever. King Arthur can't have been overcome by unbridled joy that his Round Table had become so seriously depleted after the pursuit of an ultimately fruitless quest which had claimed many lives. But things were about to get a whole lot worse for him, and indeed for the whole of Camelot. Sir Lancelot may have been regarded as the top knight of the Round Table, despite the clearly useless seating arrangements, but he also had an eye for the ladies, and that included Arthur's own wife, Queen Guinevere. Oh, no. Look, if you're the king and you're lusting after the Duke's wife, that's fine. You're the king. If you're the Duke and you're lusting after the Queen, better not. Who had clearly taken a shine to the bravest knight of them all. The affair is depicted in various different ways over the centuries, ranging from a few sneaky drunken fumbles before behind the tapestries to a heavy, long-running affair during which they made a promise to run away together the next time Arthur was busy fighting mythical dragons or whatever. Still, Arthur took the news quite well when he eventually discovered that his wife had been polishing the armor of his best knight. Dude, I feel like King Arthur would, in reality, be like, yeah, well, just chop his head off. Yeah, and my wife as well, yeah. Like King Arthur, the psycho. Well, I say he took the news quite well. Oh no, Danny is being sarcastic, isn't he? In a fit of rage, he sentenced Guinevere to be burned at the stake as punishment for her treachery. What a rotter. I don't know about you, but I'm going right off this guy right now. Yeah, I mean, what about the other guy? It's like if he... It's not like the situation where he's like, oh yeah, no, the whatever the... wasn't like, oh, well, no, I didn't know she had a boyfriend. I didn't know she was married. She's the queen, you knew. He's got to burn you at the stake as well. You should be burned first. Fortunately, Sir Lancelot staged a dramatic rescue of his beloved queen and saved her from the stake, although he killed several of his former Round Table colleagues along the way. King Arthur wasn't having any of that and rode off to France with his men in pursuit of Lancelot, leaving his son Mordred in charge of Camelot during his absence. That turned out to be a bad move. In many accounts, Mordred was the illegitimate secret child of Arthur and his own half-sister, Morgause. You weren't very subtle with the name then, were you? Although Arthur wasn't aware that he was related to Morgause at the time of the conception. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that's a little bit more forgivable, isn't it? But it's going to be a little bit of a problem. It's like, wow, why is she so up? Why is the kid so up? It looks like she's inbred or something. What's going on? Although Mordred was granted a seat at the Round Table, he became bitter over the secret incestuous circumstances of his birth and began... He's like, why is my face so weird? Why? Why did you have to your sister, King Arthur? You sick... And he began to harbour a deep hatred for his father. As soon as Mordred was temporarily left in charge, following his father's sudden trip away to clobber Lancelot, Mordred jumped on the opportunity to falsely seize the throne on a permanent basis by engaging in a misinformation campaign which suggested that Arthur had been killed in battle. As soon as he got wind of this, Arthur gave up chasing Lancelot and hot-footed it back to Camelot to find that his once peaceful kingdom was now in a chaotic state of civil war and the utopian dream had gone down the toilet. Now, this eventually led to a final showdown between King Arthur and Mordred during the Battle of Camlann, and things didn't end well for either of them. Arthur slayed his own son to teach him a valuable lesson. You're teaching him a valuable lesson, but he's dead! There's no point! But he himself was mortally wounded by Mordred during this final conflict. I'm just completely unaware of this story. I had no idea about any of this. Grimly aware that his time was up, Arthur honoured his promise to the Lady of the Lake by instructing one of his last remaining knights, Sir Bedivere, to toss Excalibur into a nearby lake. Sir Bedivere initially just hides the swords in bushes as he feels it's a waste to throw away a perfectly good sword. But Arthur is onto his game, and on the third increasingly annoyed demand from his dying king, the knight reluctantly agrees to lob it into the water, at which point a hand rises from the lake to retrieve it and take it home to the mythical realm of Avalon, where it was forged. Arthur himself also gets a ride to Avalon, in some versions of the saga at least, after he's placed on a shimmering barge that pops up out of nowhere on the lake. He sails away to the magical place where he might eventually recover from his supposedly mortal wounds. Other versions suggest that his corpse was hidden in a cave at the foot of a hill. It's completely different. It's like, you know, those ones where it's like movies that have alternate endings. This is that. But a recurring theme in many of the narratives is that he isn't quite as dead as you might have expected. And after he's been given a few hundred or few thousand years to recover from his flesh wounds, the once and future king will rise again to take his rightful place on the throne. Yeah, watch out, Charlie. And whilst the idea of a reincarnated zombie King Arthur might seem a bit of a stretch today, it's a sentiment which held sway for a staggeringly long time. The best part of a millennium later, it was reported that Philip II of Spain swore an oath during his marriage to Queen Mary I in 1554 to resign the Kingdom of England and Ireland if Arthur should ever turn up again. He's probably a skeptic of being like, yeah, I mean, I can say that, it'll be popular. And he's not going to show up because he's been dead for 1,000 years. And unlike those dumbass peasants, I'm smart, bro, I'm the king. This doesn't, however, seem to tally with the idea that the bones of Arthur and Guinevere were actually resting in Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset for hundreds of years. During reconstruction work that was taking place in 1191 following a devastating fire at the abbey, the Glastonbury monks revealed that they had stumbled across a coffin containing the remains of Arthur and Guinevere, buried alongside a lead cross that bore a Latin inscription which translates as, "Here lies interred the Isle of Avalon, the renowned King Arthur." The wooden coffin was opened to expose the skeleton of an incredibly tall man with blonde hair and a crushed skull, which was presumably from the fatal blow inflicted by his own son, alongside a woman with golden hair, which crumbled to dust as soon as one of the curious monks touched it. Considering the somewhat messy end of the relationship, it's perhaps a little surprising that Arthur and Guinevere would have been buried together, but Sir Lancelot may have had a hand in that. The way the story is often told, Guinevere became consumed by guilt following the death of Arthur and believed that her rescue from the stake had become the catalyst for the fall of Camelot. She lived the rest of her reclusive life as a nun and refused to see a heartbroken Lancelot ever again. Well, I mean, yeah, it was kind of her fault. She's like, oh no, it's all my fault. Yeah, but is it really? And the answer's like, yeah, kinda. It kind of is, Guinevere. When she died a few years later, it was Lancelot who insisted she should be buried alongside the king somewhere in Glastonbury, upon which the abbey would later be built. It wasn't until almost 100 years after the discovery of the remains by the monks that the reigning King Edward I, himself a dedicated believer of the Arthur legend, decided the bones should be given pride of place in the abbey. The remains were disinterred and moved into a fancy black marble tomb, which was put on display in the high altar of the abbey, where it remained right up until the dissolution of the monasteries in 1530s. This was the period in which King Henry VIII disbanded all the monasteries, nunneries, and friars to seize their assets, increase the regular income of the crown, and fund military campaigns, resulting in the sudden loss of almost 900 such religious houses in England, Ireland, and Wales. Just like the others, Glastonbury Abbey was looted for its riches after the monks were evicted, and the tomb of King Arthur went for a mysterious walkabout during the upheaval, after which it was never seen again. Yeah, sounds real, doesn't it? What a convenience. This must be the place. So, from Tintagel in Cornwall to Glastonbury in Somerset, we can map out the complete story of the birth and death of the official 51st Greatest Britain, even though some elements already sound a bit dodgy to me. But plenty of other places like to play on their supposed connection to the man, the myth, and occasionally the monster. Yeah, it does seem like King Arthur was a bit of a psycho. Whilst the search still goes on today for some of the real-life settings which may prove to be the more elusive locations from the saga, which problematically do not appear on your typical map. Just 4 miles southeast of Tintagel lies the small town of Camelot, which is notable for being the closest place I can pick up a decent Chinese or Indian takeaway. Dude, having to go 4 miles? I'm like, no. I need to live closer. On a more significant level, some have commented on the similarities between the names of Camelot and Camelford, which also ties in with the fact that it's remarkably close to a settlement which is believed to be the location of Arthur's final battle with Mordred. That settlement, sandwiched in between Tintagel and Camelford, goes by the charming name of Slaughterbridge. Excellent, dude. Apparently so called because Arthur and Mordred are said to have slaughtered each other on a single-track bridge that stretches over the River Camel. A little further upstream, you might spot a small memorial stone which often goes by the name of King Arthur's Stone and certainly dates back to the right period of the 6th century. The only problem is that the inscription on the stone, written in Latin and Ogham, translates as Latinus, son of Marcarus, lies here. So that's not him, right? And as nobody has ever heard of Latinus or his dad, the assumption is that he was some unknown Celtic chieftain. Whilst we're at it, the name Slaughter-Bridge is actually derived from Slothra, which is an Old English word that roughly translates as wet land or marshy place. So rather than describing a bridge on which two people were slaughtered, it's actually just meant to describe a bridge that spans a bit of a boggy spot. Moving further southeast, we eventually hit the large Cornish town of Bodmin, and this is the point where we finally hit a McDonald's and a KFC. Yes, how far though, Danny? The small lake up on Bodmin Moor goes by the name of Dosmary Pool and is said to be the home of the Lady of the Lake, the very same body of water into which Sir Arthur Bedivere finally tossed Excalibur after some heavy persuasion from Arthur. Old folk story suggests that Dosmary Pool had magical properties and may actually be bottomless, although a quick wade through the pool should fairly quickly dispel any such notion. In fact, the pool is known to run completely dry during certain points of the year. It's got nothing on Mel's Hole, which regular Decoding the Unknown viewers will recognize as the only official bottomless hole in existence today. Yeah, we did ever say, it's like, does it have a bottom? And it's like, well, obviously. They're just not measuring it very well. Some guy was like, yeah, I'll just drop a really big rope in there. And he's like, it went down like 50,000 meters. And it's like, no, it didn't. It just started like gathering on the bottom of a not particularly deep hole, Mel. You idiot! But we have to travel a little further to find potential candidates for the round table and more credible candidates for Camelot itself. There are several places scattered around the UK, all claiming to be the original location of Camelot, including Carlion in South Wales and Camelon in Scotland, with one of the most popular contenders being Cadbury Castle, a Bronze and Iron Age hill fort in Somerset, England. Cadbury Castle was first identified in print as Camelot in 1542 by the English poet and antiquary John Leland, often known as the father of English local history and bibliography. Leland didn't appear to have first-hand knowledge of this, but rather he was going on the local legends that he had picked up on his visits to the area, and it was an idea that was later expanded upon by writers and historians over the centuries. Yep. Writers and historians. It's just that weird historical blend of fiction and non-fiction. Now, the timeline does seem to fit, as excavations carried out between 1966 to 1970 revealed that the hill fort had undergone some quite extraordinary refortification during the 5th century, which was quite unlike anything else seen in Britain at the time. As pointed out by cultural historian Geoffrey Ash, who helped to get these excavations off the ground, the interesting point here is that John Leland would have been completely unaware of this when he first made the link between Camelot and Cadbury Castle in 1542. Cadbury in the UK is a very famous chocolate brand. And all I can think of when I say Cadbury Castle is some sort of like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory style castle. But whilst this suggests that Cadbury Castle was most likely a pretty happening joint ruled over by an incredibly powerful leader back in the 5th and 6th centuries, we still haven't dug up any concrete connections which would suggest that this powerful leader was Arthur. As for the Round Table, it was believed by many for hundreds of years that the genuine Round Table is the one on display in the Great Hall of Winchester in Hampshire. Oh my god! This is it! This is it! This is the one my dad told me about! It must be! Because my grandparents live in Winchester! This must have been the one! It'd been hundreds of years that a genuine Round Table is the one on display in the Great Hall of Winchester in Hampshire. The Great Hall is the only thing left standing today from Winchester Castle, which was yet another contender for Camelot. And you can still go and have a look at this massive round table if you fancy it, measuring nearly 20 feet in diameter and weighing in nearly 1.3 tons, although you can't actually sit at the table as the whole thing is rather weirdly stuck on a wall like a giant darts board. 100%, and I remember this table being on a wall. And it did look like a darts board because it had like all these sections where different people would sit, and then there'd be like a triangle pointed to the middle of the table for each one. Duh! So my dad wasn't trying to trick me. It's just people really believe this, but it's fiction. But it has a bit of competition, as the Chest Amphitheatre, a mighty circular stone and wood structure which can hold 10,000 people, is also believed by some to be the Round Table. Oh, okay, but it's a whole amphitheatre. The city of Chester was originally founded by the Romans as a legionary fortress, and one of Arthur's many famous battles was said to have taken place in the city of the Legion. The 6th century Welsh monk Gildas, who we'll be hearing more from in just a moment, also claimed that a martyr's shrine could be found somewhere within the City of Legions. So, archaeologists got more than a little excited in the 2000s when they found what is believed to be the stone base from a shrine built in Roman times within the amphitheatre. In truth, the base tells us very little about what the shrine was supposed to represent, but it did cause a bit of a buzz and further fueled theories that the Round Table wasn't necessarily just a nice bit of furniture, but a huge circular gathering gathering place situated near one of Arthur's most famous victories. I feel like this is really like, oh, well, in 1,000 years, people being like, oh, we found the ruins of this giant castle in Scotland, and inside it, we found, like, I don't know, some fucking goblets. I remember nothing about the Harry Potter books, which I have read, but it's like, oh yeah, no, it must be the Goblet of Fire. And it's like, but you're just making stuff up based on fiction. Why were you all taking this so seriously? Suddenly, the idea that the round table could seat 1,600 guests doesn't seem quite so wacky after all. They could squeeze over 6 times that amount in there. Whilst we leave the Great Hall of Winchester to slug it out with the Chester Amphitheatre, over which is more likely to be the home of the real round table, other proud locals are arguing over the real location of the Isle of Avalon. Oh my god, stop wasting your time, guys. You're just wasting so much. It's like people looking for Atlantis. It was a fictional device used by Plato, you idiots.
What an idiot!
Candidates include Bardsley Island in Wales, the Isles of Sicily, and the Isle of Lundy in the Bristol Channel. But the most popular suggestion takes us right back to Glastonbury, this time to the large hill known as Glastonbury Tor, which became heavily associated with Celtic mythology from the 19th century onwards and was often considered to contain a hidden entrance to Avalon, or the land of fairies, or the land of the dead. I suppose this would help add a little more logic as to why the coffin found in Glastonbury Abbey bore an inscription which declared that the remains of Arthur and Guinevere had been interred in the Isle of Avalon. Glastonbury Abbey was only a short hop from Glastonbury Tor, which itself was the Isle of Avalon. But hang on a second, we might be getting a little carried away here. Whilst it might be reasonable, in a way, to consider today's potential locations for some of the bigger set pieces associated with the life and battles and death of King Arthur, we've already found ourselves at the stage where we're looking for mythical realms where elves craft magical swords and mortally wounded men make a complete recovery. Thank you, Danny. Aren't we ever? Maybe it's time to rewind all the way back to the original sources to discover how exactly this whole story unfolded in the first place. Road to nowhere. Now, the frustrating thing here is that there are absolutely no contemporary references to King Arthur in any records or documents produced during his supposed lifespan. And he's the king, my dudes. If there's someone they know about, it's him. Usually believed to be around the late 5th and early 6th century, and straight away this might ring several cloister bells, as you would think somebody of the era would have found the town to at least have jotted down at least a few notes about the heroic king who triumphed in 12 mighty battles, held off the Saxon invasion for decades, and forged a mighty new kingdom. Yeah, my dude, maybe just, huh? But it's not quite as suspicious as you might think, because Arthur supposedly lived during the Dark Ages. Well, sort of, but the Dark Ages are more complicated than we think. And also, really? The king? They're not going to have any record of the king? And contrary to popular misconceptions, the Dark Ages doesn't refer to a barbaric era of ignorance and cultural backwardness. Doesn't it just refer to the, isn't it kind of just part of the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages kind of not a thing? Right? Or like, it wasn't as extreme as everyone seems to think. If I remember correctly. E.g., I can't get a Wi-Fi signal around here. It's like living in the Dark Ages. Oh my god. Things I said. I once stayed at an Airbnb and I was like, yeah, what's the Wi-Fi password? And they're like, there isn't any Wi-Fi. I'm like, what do you mean there's no Wi-Fi? And they're like, well, on the listing it says no internet. And I'm like, why the would I check that? Everywhere is internet. I'm not in the middle of nowhere. What the So what I allegedly did was I found their Wi-Fi box and I manually reset it, and then I set up a new Wi-Fi network and logged into it, and they just had to deal with the consequences of that, allegedly. Because I'm not going a week without Wi-Fi. Instead, it refers to a period of historical obscurity, at the Dark Ages that is, as very few contemporary records are known to survive. Yeah, but if something is going to survive, it's going to be about the king, isn't it? Whilst the preceding years of the Roman Empire are pretty well documented in comparison, we simply don't know all that much about the period between the 5th and the 10th centuries, as we have few records to draw upon, and this is possibly because everyone was too busy just trying to survive and didn't have much time to fanny about writing stuff down. So, the lack of contemporary evidence linked with Arthur is not in itself a strong indication that King Arthur never existed. I do like living in the future, right? Because if we were in the past, you'd just have to be worrying like, oh no, what am I going to eat tonight? And it's like, I have no idea what I'm going to eat tonight, but you know what? I'm not going to be hungry. And that allows me to do all sorts of creative things during the day and have like a nice life rather than being like, uh-oh, gotta go out and hunt. Or it's like, oh, that guy gave me the side eye. He could just murder me. past, man. The future's great. I know it's not perfect and we got a long way to go. And I'm sure people in 100 years will be like, God damn, the past was bad. 2025. But I like it right now. It's quite nice. So, the lack of contemporary evidence linked with King Arthur is not in itself a strong indication that King Arthur never existed. No, but it is an indication, isn't it? However, we do at least have one surviving document from the period in the shape of a 3-part sermon called De Assedio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, put together by that Welsh monk Gildas at some point in the 6th century. Gildas puts together an account of all the significant events that led up to his own lifetime, including a brief and rather vague account of the famous Battle of Mount Barden, in which the Saxons were pushed back in defeat. Let me guess, doesn't mention old King Arthur, who, if the legend's to be believed, played quite a pivotal part in that, didn't he? But he makes no reference to a bloke called Arthur, which is a bit odd considering that Arthur was supposed to be the top dog at that time, and Mount Barden was meant to be one of his mightiest victories. Exactly. Having said that, although Gildas waffles on at length about all kinds of stuff, he does have a tendency to be light on detail when it comes to the important stuff that historians might have actually found a bit useful. He does make reference to another rallying war leader of the time who was a Romanized Briton by the name of Ambrosius Aurelianus, but he doesn't get a particularly detailed biography, and he doesn't sound as hardcore as Arthur, as Gildas notes that Ambrosius won some battles and lost others. Gildas doesn't even mention whether Ambrosius was present at the Battle of Mount Barden, and doesn't give anybody the credit for leading the Britons to victory. So on the face of it, this does seem a bit disappointing that the only significant historical source we have from the period is notably Arthur Free. But there are a few things to bear in mind here. One slightly nutty theory is that Gildas purposefully snubbed Arthur from his works after the king killed the monk's troublemaking older brother, but this appears to be a complete myth concocted later as a reason to explain Arthur's absence from the texts. Who's doing this? These are like anti-historians. People who are just making up excuses for things not being there and not actually basing it on the facts. These are like anti-historians, like the ancient aliens people, or the, I don't know, that famous British guy. What's his name? Is it David Icke? Like, anti-historians. That's how I see these people. There are a couple of more sensible explanations. The thing about On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain is there was actually a very long, scathing rant about the state of Britain after the Romans had done a runner, heaping all the blame for the current mess on the recent leaders, clergymen, and a general idiot population as a whole. Could also be placed on the Romans, who came in, tried to sort shit out, and then just left. Kind of reminds it like Afghanistan. Americans came in, tried to sort shit out, and then just left. And now it's the Taliban. Woo! Jesus Christ. What a surprise that this doesn't work out well, guys. So rather than aiming for total historical accuracy and detail, it's more of a rambling, opinionated sermon, which culminates in a call for everyone to return to Christian values before Britain sinks into the pit of hell. But another point is that aside from the sole exception of Ambrosius Aurelianus, Gildas never refers to any other leader by name. So it's not just Arthur who fails to get a name check, it's almost everybody else. Whilst not everybody can agree on the exact dates for the Battle of Mount Barden, it was either in the late 5th or early 6th century. The hazy timeline presented by Gildas suggests that it may have been sometime after Ambrosius was already out of the picture. We may have taken different perspectives on things if Gildas had explicitly stated that it was Ambrosius who had led his men to victory at Mount Barden, although I suspect this may have just led to speculation that Ambrosius Aurelianus was the real Arthur. But the fact that nobody is given credit still leaves plenty of room for Arthur in this picture. It's just that Gildas doesn't seem keen on naming leaders in his lengthy diatribe against anybody in Britain who wasn't a monk. Evidence of absence of evidence. Evidence of absence is not absence of evidence. What's that phrase where it's like just because he wasn't in there doesn't mean that he was? Right? Totally butchering that, but you know what I mean, right? The first time Arthur's name pops up in print is within a Welsh poem entitled The Goddardin, in a series of reflections on the struggles of Brittonic people known as the Goddardin, who lived in what we'd now recognise as southern Scotland and northern England. We don't know for sure who wrote this poem. It used to be attributed to the 6th century war poet Aneurin, which would have made it the first known reference to Arthur by quite some way. Scholars now argue that it could have been written at any point between the 6th and 11th centuries, which isn't incredibly helpful, but even the latter end of that scale still makes it a very early surviving example of Welsh poetry. It's kind of interesting that we can't tell based on the language of something when exactly it's from. Don't we have references? Because I feel if you read this script, I think there would be references and words that could place it within maybe 10 years of its writing, I would say, I think. there's just, because if you read something that's a bit old, people refer to things in different ways. They use different slang and such things. Couldn't they date it by looking at what we know writing was like in other documents? Anyway, the Goddardin only makes a fleeting reference to a character from history known as Arthur, but it is quite an intriguing one. The author is actually describing a Goddardin hero by the name of Guorida, who is leading the charge in reclaiming a former Roman base which had been taken over by the Angles. Here's what the poem says about Guorda, and I know Guorda is probably a difficult word to pronounce, so this is the last time I'll be using it. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate that. He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. That's it. That's it. 2 lines, 2 short lines. The reference to feeding black ravens presumably means that this particular warrior killed a lot of enemies in battle. Oh, okay, providing quick snacks for passing ravens. Okay, I guess so. Isn't it? Is it ravens? I thought it was, what's that bird? Buzzards. Isn't it buzzards that famously eat dead people? Or dead bodies? Dead animals, whatever. But the second line implies that while he was a pretty tough cookie, he wasn't in the same league as the legendary Arthur. Sounds honestly like he's just like, yeah, that guy liked feeding birds. He'd go out there with his bird seed and scatter it around. But he's not like that weird guy Arthur who'd go out there like 3 times a day and feed the birds. That Arthur guy was weird. He had a thing for birds, like Tesla. The name doesn't get mentioned again in the poem, and the author doesn't elaborate on who Arthur was, but that itself is the fascinating point, as this indicates there was no need to elaborate at the time. A contemporary audience would have already been well aware of Arthur and would have known how he was the top-level warrior that others could only aspire to be. Now that is an interesting point. I'll be fair. If someone today just happened to casually throw the name of Roger Federer into a conversation, they wouldn't usually feel obliged to explain his life story before getting to the point. It's like, yeah, that guy's like the Roger Federer of YouTube. My dream. It's like, Roger Federer, the extremely competent tennis player. If you're explaining it, you've not chosen someone who's famous enough. Even someone who knows nothing about tennis is going to be like, oh, I know Roger Federer is good at tennis. I know nothing about football, but I know Ronaldo is good at football. If someone's like Ronaldo of YouTube, I'll be like, I guess Ronaldo is the Ronaldo of YouTube these days. But you know what I mean? It's like, he's good at football. Like Arthur is good at feeding birds. It's such a shame that we can't be a bit more precise with the dating of the poem. As we'll discover in just a moment, Arthur's life began to open up a lot more in texts from the 9th century onwards. So if this poem was written after the 9th century, the inclusion of Arthur's name wouldn't be such a big deal. I think, given with absence of anything else, we have to assume that it's post 9th century then, because it is mentioning Arthur, right? Whilst historians continue to argue over the dating, it's fair to say that the most widely held scholarly opinions tend to veer close to the 6th century. Okay, shit, I was wrong for a variety of reasons, including the linguistics and style of the poem. Well, that's exactly what I was saying. Use that to date it, which are far more in tune with the language of the 6th century than of the 11th. Yeah, can you imagine reading from something from like 500 years ago and being like, I don't know, it kind of sounds like it could be from today. Of course not. You read something from 100 years ago, it's confusing. Like, I've told this story before. I was reading some Hemingway book, and they're all talking about getting tight all the time. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like, let's go out and get tight. And I'm like, what? And eventually I just look it up, and it's like some old word. It's just slang that people used to call getting drunk. And that was 80 years ago. I was maybe 100 years ago, 1920s, 30s? Shit, I don't know. But they were calling getting drunk tight. So you could date shit by the words within, I'd say, decades, but not a historian. I suppose amateur historian. Sometimes you see your name, like you're self-described online, and it's like amateur historian, and I'm like, yeah, I guess so. That means sort of. Sure, why not? And if that's the case, then the poet's brief inclusion of a mighty name, which he assumes will already be familiar to his audience, is a slice of history more enchanting than anything to have fallen out of Merlin's spellbook. So, let's hop forward to the 9th century, when the Welsh monk Nennius is believed to have first put a little more flesh on Arthur's bones in his work, The History of the Britons, which was written around 828. There's no mention of Arthur ever being a king in this hefty volume of work, but instead he's painted as a heroic war leader or military commander. More specifically, Arthur is labelled Dux Bellorum, which is a Latin phrase used to describe a leader of wars in the Roman era and subsequently used for a while by Romanized Britons. For the first time Nennius gives Arthur the credit for leading his men to victory at the Battle of Mount Barden, but Arthur was a pretty busy chap, as this was apparently just one of 12 echo battles in which he triumphed, including fisticuffs at the City of Legion, Mount Agnet, and the fortress at Ginion. Nennius depicts Arthur as such a badass that he probably didn't even need any backup from his men. In one scene, the monk describes how Arthur single-handedly disposed of 960 enemies in one charge. Well, now you immediately know it's fiction, don't you? Because that's impossible. Not even Jason Bourne could do that shit. Whilst his men presumably sat around and argued over who had forgotten to pack the half-time oranges, it seems clear that Arthur was no Guarida. Sorry, that name just slipped out again. That's okay, Danny. I'm just guessing on the pronunciation. It's weird. It kind of looks like it's Welsh. Was it Welsh? It looks Welsh. There's not enough vowels, you know. This was followed up in the 9th century by a series of Latin chronicles called the Annals of Wales, which was put together by, would you believe it, a group of Welsh monks. No. The title's a bit misleading as it also covers significant events in history relating to Cornwall, Scotland, and Ireland. But the Annals of Wales are notable for getting a little bit more specific with dates, although we have to convert them from the Easter cycle into the Gregorian calendar framework. According to these chronicles, Arthur triumphed in battle in the year 516, but confusingly, this appears to conflict with interpretations of the 6th century on the ruin and conquest of Britain by Gildas, which, whilst not giving explicit dates, implied that the battle was fought in the 490s. The Annals of Wales also provides the first details of the battle in which Arthur fell in Camlan in 537 alongside a guy called Medrot, who appears to be an early version of Mordred, although his relationship with Arthur is not established here, and it's not even made clear if they were fighting each other or on the same side. Interesting to note as well is that Camlan sounds a little bit like Camelot, although this is simply meant to be the scene of Arthur's death rather than the name of his kingdom. Of course, Arthur doesn't even have a kingdom in these earlier surviving references on account of him not being a king. He's more of a bloodthirsty warrior who could single-handedly take on an entire army while hopping on one foot and reciting the alphabet backwards. Yeah. That's Danny's way of saying it's fictional, because it's fictional. You can't take out 960 men with one stupid magical sword, because magical swords aren't real, so just be a regular sword. 960 men? I don't think you could take out 960 small children. At this point, he's without a crown and without a supporting cast. There's no sign of Guinevere, Merlin, Lancelot, Galahad, or any of the usual gang. So far, it's a bit like watching an episode of Friends that only has Ross in it, or an episode of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, carried entirely by Shaggy. An episode of Friends with just Ross would be weird. However, some key players in Arthur's mob do eventually surface for the first time in the 1136 book, The History of the Kings of Britain, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was absolutely not a Welsh monk, he was a Welsh cleric. Using translated versions of ancient materials, which had not been available to the earlier chroniclers, Geoffrey of Monmouth, let's just call him Jeffroar, shall we, was the first to provide us with a detailed biography of Arthur, beginning with his backstory, in which his Celtic father, Ulster Pendragon, becomes king before taking a fancy to the Duke of Cornwall's wife and enlisting the help of his curious advisor, a magician called Merlin, to get inside the castle at Tintagel, where Arthur is conceived under very shady circumstances. Yes, he was. This version of Merlin is not so much a spell-casting wizard with a pointy hat, but more of a hyper-intelligent strategist and prophet with a divine insight who goes on to help Arthur after Pendragon kicks the bucket. That sounds like someone who'd be really useful to have on your team. A hyper-intelligent strategist with divine insight. It's like, no, he's incredible at strategy, can also basically see the future. Be like, I need that dude. That's my dude. I want him. Like, he should consult for me. In Jeff's work, we learn that Ambrosius Aurelianus, mentioned in the 6th century sermon by Gildas, was actually the brother of Ulster Pendragon, and so therefore Arthur's uncle, although he died before Arthur was born. We also get the first confirmation that Arthur was indeed a king, hence his inclusion in a book entitled The History of the Kings of Britain, who went on to marry Guinevere and brought peace to the land after holding back the Saxons with the aid of his brave knights, although we don't yet get introduced to any of the big-name knights such as Lancelot or Galahad. The book also provides the first reference to Arthur's magical sword, which goes by the name of Caliburnus here. And whilst Arthur and Mordred ultimately slay each other at the Battle of Camlan, there's a significant difference to how they reached that point. The Mordred of this version is actually the nephew of Arthur, who is temporarily left in command after Arthur goes off to wage war against the Roman Emperor Lucius. Mordred seizes the throne and claims Guinevere as his wife to help cement his position, but it's not made exactly clear how Guinevere felt about this turn of events. So we can see that Jeff laid down the foundations of many of the more familiar elements of Arthurian legend in his work and was the first to give the hero a crown. But there's a troubling problem here with his sources. What a surprise! How did Jeff manage to track down those previously unseen ancient records and documents which enabled him to expand so deeply on the life of the now King Arthur? Let me guess, Danny, he didn't, and he just made it up because it's the past, and, being a historian was a lot more flexible back then. Well, he obtained them from his drinking buddy Walter, who just happened to be the Archdeacon of Oxford, and who happened to let Jeff take a look at an ancient Celtic manuscript which had been lost for centuries. Okay, the problem was that Geoffrey of Monmouth point-blank refused to show anybody else the manuscript or divulge any solid information about it, while also dropping hints that he made his own new additions without revealing what they were. Why would you do that? Why would you drop hints? It's like, I got this magical book, which I can't show you, also changed it a little bit. Why would you say that last bit? He could very well have just been making shit up from start to finish, possibly in a bid to fashion a new Celtic hero that the Welsh could claim as their own. If we were being generous, we could pause to consider how strict historical accuracy wasn't always considered a top priority back in the days when Jeff was compiling his work exactly. It was more about weaving a simple narrative and a compelling story from the limited resources available. Jeff certainly wasn't the only writer of the period composing alleged history drawn from real facts, half-truths, myths, and legends. A less generous perspective might suggest that Geoffrey of Monmouth was just taking the piss with this nonsense. And although the history of the kings of Britain was a massive success printed all over the world, even the scholars of the time were snootily dismissive of the work, with the 12th century English historian William of Newburgh declaring, "It is quite clear that everything this man wrote about Arthur and his successors was made up, partly by himself, partly by others, either from an inordinate love of lying or for the sake of pleasing the Britons." In short, the history of the kings of Britain is now regarded as a work of fiction rather than historical analysis. You don't say. It doesn't really get any more promising after this point. After Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, the Arthurian stories began to leak into French culture, inspiring the poets of the time to come up with romanticized and, of course, entirely fabricated additions to the myth. French poet Chrétien de Troyes composed whole cycles of Arthurian romance, which introduced the dashing Sir Lancelot and his doomed affair with Guinevere. Chrétien de Troyes also sows the seeds of the quest for the Holy Grail and introduces us to the Lady of the Lake. And he names Camelot for the first time, although back then Arthur was supposed to have actually ruled from the Welsh city of Carlion, and Camelot was just one part of that territory. On top of all that, Chrétien de Troyes takes it upon himself to change the name of the magic sword from Calburnius to Excalibur, which eventually evolved into Excalibur when translated to English. The French poet Robert de Boron was one of the first to go into detail on a young Arthur pulling out the sword of the stone to become king. He also greatly expands on the supposed biblical origins of the Holy Grail, suggesting for the first time that it contains the blood of Jesus, placing more significance on the spiritual quest undertaken by Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. Speaking of which, the very first mention of the Round Table is attributed to the 12th century Norman poet Wace, although he didn't spend too much time dwelling on it. The table was only extended to its full length by later French poetry, such as the Vulgate cycle from the 13th century, which is not clearly attributed to specific authors. The Vulgate cycle reduces the role of Arthur somewhat, as the characters of Funky Merlin and Twice-a-Night Lancelot are pushed to top billing, whilst it's within this cycle that we first hear about Mordred being the illegitimate son of Arthur and his half-sister. So basically, one guy kicked off the storytelling, and now people are picking up the storytelling and just expanding on the lore. They're like doing fan fiction in a way. Eventually, the best bits of this were all cobbled together in 1485 when English author Sir Thomas Malory produced what might now be considered the definitive compilation of Arthurian legends named La Mort d'Arthur, which translates from Anglo-Norman French as The Death of Arthur. While Sir Thomas Malory, we should title this episode The Death of Arthur. While Sir Thomas Malory sprinkles in a few ideas and themes of his own, leading more heavily into knightly honour and chivalric code and weaving together a more detailed exploration of the tragic rise and fall of Camelot, he's essentially drawing upon previous sources and poetry to create a complete cohesive story from Arthur's birth to his death at the Battle of Camlan and his final journey to the Isle of Avalon. So he's basically just speculating. You couldn't even get away with on Wikipedia. They'd be like, this article seems to be filled with speculation. It's possible that Sir Thomas Malory only decided to put together this masterwork because he had very little to do at the time. Whilst there's some debate over the true identity of Malory, as there were quite a few prominent Thomas Malorys knocking around at the time, the most widely held view is that this Malory led a pretty complicated double life as a respected knight of the realm and a thoroughly violent criminal accused of sexual assault, attempted murder, and plots to overthrow the king. It was during his final stint in prison that it's believed he decided to draft his book. What an upstanding guy who we can definitely rely on for historical accounts. But as we can clearly see, the story of Arthur was constantly retooled in the long lead up to Le Mort d'Arthur. Now, we kicked off with brief descriptions of a feared murderous warrior who comes across like a medieval Rambo but later evolves into a wise and mostly dignified king as the saga moves into a romantic fairy tale realm of holy quests and dragons and magical swords. In fact, the character of Arthur only softens even more in later versions of the tale, glumly accepting the affair between Guinevere and Lancelot, forgiving them both, rather than sentencing his wife to death. But just letting the dude be like, yo, dude, you're good, don't worry about it, man. Just stay away from my next wife, all right? An extraordinary point to ponder here is that despite the more fantastical elements of the legend and the conflicting accounts of Kind's gentle and peaceful savage beast, Arthur was still widely and unquestionably believed to be a genuine historic character for hundreds of years, and there were still many who believed that the once and future king would eventually return from Avalon. He's basically like another version of Jesus, isn't he? They're waiting for his return. Christ will come again. Arthur will come again. There was a good reason why King Edward I insisted that remains of Arthur and Guinevere be disinterred and moved to a more prominent place in a marble tomb in Glastonbury Abbey in 1278. It was thought at the time that he was simply paying respect to a former king, but he had an ulterior motive. King Charles I was attempting to conquer Wales at the time, and he was troubled by all this talk of an old king of Welsh origin returning to claim the throne. By moving the remains of Arthur into the high altar of the abbey, he was trying to reinforce the idea that the old king was clearly as dead as a doornail, and there was no way that he was making a comeback. Yeah, obviously he's dead. He's bones. He's dust. Moving forward in time, King Henry VII, who ruled between 1485 and 1509, was keen to play on the Arthur angle and suggested a strong personal connection with the former ruler of Camelot. Whilst never explicitly suggesting that he was a direct descendant, Henry VII liked to imply that he was the spiritual successor of Arthur, who shared the same values, whilst heavily promoting his own Welsh heritage and the fact that he was born at Winchester Castle, which many saw as the original Camelot and home of that round table that's still on display today. In a sense, he was making a subtle suggestion that the once and future king had indeed finally returned, but in the shape of Henry VII. It's like, yeah, no, I've returned. I'm Arthur. They'll be like, all right, he is the king. Yeah, sure you are, King Arthur, right? Yeah, great. Fucking idiot. It was his long-term plan to install another Arthur on the throne when he gave the name to his firstborn son and heir apparent. But sadly, Prince Arthur died at the age of just 15, and so his younger brother eventually got the gig, which is how we ended up with nearly 40 years of Henry VIII instead. However, Arthur may have been riding a wave of popularity in the 16th century, but it was a very different story the following century when he really began to fall out of fashion, and the former bestseller Le Mort d'Arthur found itself out of print for the best part of 200 years. It seems that people was finally coming around to the idea that the whole concept was just a load of absurd nonsense that wasn't worth bothering with anymore. The king, who apparently never truly died, really did seem to finally fall into silence for a remarkably long time. It wasn't until the 19th century that poets such as William Wordsworth, John Keats, and Alfred Tennyson fell back in love with the myths and legends of the ancient king, and we've never really looked back since. You don't usually have to wait very long for a new Arthurian adaptation to hit the TV or movie screens, while the most recent being Guy Ritchie's 1927 film Legend of the Sword. Never even heard of this. And Guy Ritchie's very famous as a director, which dared to throw out most of the familiar elements such as Lancelot and Guinevere and reduce Merlin to a fleeting cameo appearance. It was hardly a roaring success, and although it was somewhat ambitiously intended to be the first in a series of 6 films, the remaining 5 were swiftly cancelled. Well, it happens when a movie doesn't perform. Just a couple of years later in 2019, British comedian and filmmaker Joe Cornish treated us to a more light-hearted, modernised take on the legend in the form of The Kid Who Would Be King. Starring Patrick Stewart as Merlin, this one brings back memories for me as the production of it prevented me from visiting a local pub for over a week. That's how long it took the film crew to do their stuff when they pretty much took over Tintagel, blocked off the main road, and temporarily rebranded nearly every pub and shop in the village to make them all sound even more preposterous, although I did secretly approve of the temporary erection of Merlin's Arcade. I'm not sure why it took them so long, as you can only really see a couple of minutes footage of Tintagel in the final cut. Yeah, because movies take so long. You'd be like, oh my god, they're filming this, and it goes on forever, and then in the movie it's like just one like tiny shot. And you're like, oh my god, you guys spent like days doing this. And I'm not sure if the footage still survives of the scene where a local YouTube scriptwriter and his dog interrupt filming to grumpily inquire where on earth you're supposed to go for a sneaky pint now. Well, it's not a bad film. This one didn't perform too well either, losing an estimated $50 million or so for 21st Century Fox. God damn. So maybe Arthur isn't quite as popular today as he seems to think he is. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, is it? Do people care? Not really. Stop making sense. But now that we found ourselves back in Tintagel again, this would be a good spot for us to sit down on Merlin's big pointy rock and ponder over why exactly so many people are still spending so much time trying to find connections between real-life locations and fantasy literature. Yes, Danny! Yes! It is a mystery to me. I mean, it's all very well Geoffrey of Monmouth claiming in 1136 that Tintagel was the location where Arthur was conceived, but it's not very helpful that he refused to reveal his ancient sources. And it begins to sound a bit suspect when Jeff claims in the same breath, or at least in the same volume of work, that Arthur's conception was assisted by a magician who transformed Arthur Pendragon into the form of the Duke of Cornwall. Yes, some people might be thinking that you're not reading something that's historically accurate. Weird, isn't it? Still, that's not to say that something very interesting wasn't going down in Tintagel at around the same time that Arthur may have lived. Maybe not in the actual castle. This wasn't even built until way later in the 13th century by Earl Richard of Cornwall, and weirdly, it never appeared to serve any kind of military or strategic purpose. Richard of Cornwall just wanted a fancy new holiday pad, which was inspired by Arthurian legend, perhaps in a bid to suggest that he was a natural successor to Arthur, the fictional character. 1,000 years, people would be like, no, I'm the reincarnation of Harry Potter, and therefore I must lead you. Stupid.
You are made of stupid.
More than anything, it feels like a tribute put together by a slightly obsessive fan. Whilst he may have intended for it to be a cool place to hang out and feast on roast pig with the rich and powerful, it does sound pretty awesome. He probably barely even visited the place himself, as he was quite busy fighting holy crusades and later becoming the king of Germany. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, when you're the person who can, afford to go build your own castle or whatever, you're probably quite busy doing all the shit that allows you to afford to have that castle. I think it's only in movies or for the privileged, inherited wealth crowd, where it's like you get to have lots of cool and have the time to use it. That's nice. Elon Musk, he's worth half a trill, something like that. He's wildly wealthy. I don't imagine he has much time to have much fun with his money because he's always busy, and he probably likes being busy. Even so, evacuations of the headlands, which initially kicked off in 1933, have continued to dig up treasure since as recently as 2017, and they've concluded that Tintagel was certainly home to an incredibly affluent settlement of sorts in the 6th century, which was quite unlike almost anything else you'd find in a region struggling with poverty, wars, deprivation, and a breakdown of trading and transport routes. Is it, though? In countries which are really poor, all of the rich people tend to get together and they'll build a community and they'll put a big old wall around it and be like, this is where the rich people live. Because there's lots of not rich people around who they want to stay away from. So I think in a place where things are really bad, there will be little alcoves of wealth. Always. You go to the poorest country in the world, I promise you there's rich people. They're going to be somewhere. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of fancy dwellings, wine bottles from Greece, glass goblets from Spain, serving bottles from Turkey, and ceramic bowls from Tunisia. In fact, more pottery from the Eastern Mediterranean has been found in Tintagel than anywhere else in the country at the time put together. And there's no other settlement from the period in southern England that comes close to matching the size of this one, not even London. Holy shit, okay. So it does appear that while the rest of the country was largely going to shit, the folk of 6th century Tintagel were actually doing alright for themselves, and the evidence suggests that it was an incredibly prosperous trading centre, and perhaps even a place of great influence and power. And this does make you wonder why Geoffrey of Monmouth chose Tintagel as the location for the origin story of Arthur, as it would have been a pretty barren and forgotten hole by the time he got around to writing about it in the 12th century. Did he just happen to get lucky when he randomly picked this isolated spot in Britain that reeks of rare power and wealth and perhaps even royalty in ways that wouldn't be uncovered until the 20th century? It's a good question, isn't it? Maybe there was something from history that was lost, talking about how Tintagel used to be awesome. Or it could just be like in the oral tradition, like someone's passed down stories that weren't really written down, something like that. So no, just speculating here. It is a little bit of a mystery. Or did he really know something about the rich history of the place? Alas, we've left it close to 1,000 years too late to ask him now. That is very interesting. That is like the one like true mystery of today's episode. I'm like, wow, how did he know? Probably just coincidence, but can't say for sure. Maybe that mysterious ancient Celtic manuscript that aided him in his research will turn up one day and make us all look like witless knaves. There are a couple of other things we can settle right now, though, like that round table in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle, for example. While this was believed by Arthur truthers to be the real deal for hundreds of years, carbon dating undertaken in the 1970s confirmed that it was actually just a replica, which was likely commissioned in the late 12th century by King Edward I. Shock, horror. Visitors to the Great Hall may have already found it a bit confusing that the table on display on the wall depicts a portrait of King Henry VIII sitting at the top, but it seems that the table was given a fresh lick of paint at some point during his reign in the early 16th century. Wait, what the? Henry VIII was like, yeah, you know, I'm just going to paint over that Arthur goon and put me in there. Henry decided he wanted his own image plastered onto the seat at the head of the table, which kind of goes against the whole concept of the round table, but never mind. The whole concept of the round table went out the window because someone's the king and he could just be like, off with your head. That means the table ain't round, no matter how round you may think it may be. While some still claim that the Chester Amphitheatre is a more likely king-size candidate, no Arthurian evidence has ever been located on the site. And as we've already established that the Round Table first popped up in the 12th century poetry attempting to capture mood and emotion rather than faintly reliable records attempting to capture accurate historic details, maybe we should just give up looking for it. Yes, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But if we're still looking for other evidence to prove King Arthur really existed, then surely we already have all we need in the form of his dead body. Oh right, in the marble tomb or wherever that was moved. Yeah, but that could just be anyone's old bones. Well, we might not have his remains anymore, not since they went missing after Glastonbury Abbey was looted in the 1530s. But I've been saying, someone looted a body? How desperate are you? It's like, oh, someone nicked all the good TVs. I'm just going to take this body. But up until that point, the black marble tomb, reported to contain the remains of both Arthur and Guinevere, had definitely been on display at the Abbey since 1278, almost a century after the monks first revealed they had found Arthur's original coffin. And if you can't trust a bunch of monks, then who can you trust? Yeah, because monks don't have an agenda. It was actually the reigning Henry II who first suggested that they had received a tip-off from an anonymous Welsh bard that King Arthur's true grave could be found somewhere between two pillars at Glastonbury Abbey. Strangely, though, nobody appeared to act on this information during Henry's own lifetime. It sounds as if Henry II was playing a similar game to one of his successors, Edward I, in that he was simply trying to publicly discourage the idea that the once and future king was still licking his wounds and planning his return from the Isle of Avalon. Arthur was instead just a pile of bones lying inside a wooden coffin. It wasn't until a couple of years after the death of Henry II, and indeed a few years after Glastonbury Abbey was ravaged by a terrible fire, that the monks claimed to have finally found the coffin of which Henry II had spoken. There were actually several myths and legends and barefaced porkies circling around Glastonbury Abbey right up until its dissolution in the 16th century. For hundreds of years, the idea was promoted that the Abbey was the oldest Christian church in Britain, dating all the way back to 63 AD when it was first constructed by Christ's disciples. In fact, later archaeological detective work concluded that it was built much later, probably at some point around the 7th century, but the idea of the Abbey being so closely tied to the roots of Christianity certainly helped to whip up regular donations. And raising a few extra quid is more than likely what was on the minds of those crafty monks when they first claimed to have stumbled across the remains of King Arthur and Guinevere. Shocking that these monks had a hidden agenda, right? They're monks. Why? We should be able to trust them! In the aftermath of the fire, the monks were pretty desperate for coin to help fund the rebuilding of the Abbey, a mammoth task which spanned several years. And during this period, they just happened to find all sorts of incredible discoveries within the Abbey, including the grave of St. Patrick and the remains of St. Dunstan. It's also been suggested that they may have claimed to have found the remains of our old friend Gildas, the Welsh monk who carelessly forgot to mention Arthur at any point in his 6th century sermon on the ruin and conquest of Britain. King Arthur was the very last of these improbable finds. The monks of the Abbey had clearly decided not to push their team. I'm just going to be like, yeah, why don't these monks go full on? Be like, we've got Jesus. We found Jesus. He's in a marble coffin now. Come and worship him and give us money. I guess King Arthur was kind of the believable lie. The monks of the air clearly not decided to push their luck by claiming to have found the carcass of the donkey that had carried Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. Oh god, the monks had clearly put a lot of evidence in convincing everyone that the discovery was genuine, even going so far as to forge that lead cross with the Latin inscription. However, whilst neither the coffin nor the lead cross exist today, we can deduce from contemporary chronicles that the inscription was composed in 12th century Latin rather than 6th century Latin, which is something of a glaring anachronistic monastery boy error. Yeah, that's 600. Can you imagine reading something from the 15th century and being like, oh yeah, no, that sounds the same as stuff today? Of course not. It'd be crazy. People spoke different in the 90s. The discovery of the remains of King Arthur was nothing more than a cheeky fundraising scam to attract yet more generous tourists and even bigger donations. The slightly disconcerting element is that somebody's remains were in that wooden coffin and later moved into a marble tomb, but the monks never let on who was being falsely paraded as Arthur and Guinevere. Yeah, I don't think that's particularly weird. Like, these old churches and monasteries and stuff, they must have like hundreds or thousands of old bodies just lurking out in like the cellars or in the garden. What's it called? In the graveyard. Like, that they could dig up, and it's like, oh yeah, well, no one knows who this is. The tombstone fell down years ago. It's all covered in moss. Let's just dig up the body and pretend it's Arthur. Boom! No one missed him. No one cares. All of that person's been forgotten by everyone who ever loved them. Oh god, we're all going to die and just return to dust, and then eventually everyone will forget about us. Oh my. Speaking in tongues. So, this now doesn't leave us with an awful lot to go on. Here's a saga which has evolved over the centuries to fit an ever-changing audience and present a suitable hero for whoever was in need of one at the time. Just about all of the more familiar elements were literary and poetic additions made after Geoffrey of Monmouth first fleshed out the story from a dubious unnamed source in 1136. And that includes Guinevere, Lancelot, Excalibur, the Round Table, the Lady of the Lake, the Quest of the Holy Grail, and the whole of Camelot itself, alongside the hitherto unmentioned Morgana Le Fay. Who the f*** is this? I've only avoided mentioning Morgana Le Fay because I didn't want to risk over-egging an already complicated recipe, as she's such an ever-shifting character without much in the way of a singular, widely shared narrative. Depending on who you ask, she's either a powerful hero with a close connection to Camelot, a cruel and jealous adversary, Arthur's sister, a goddess, a witch, or just a deeply confused individual born way before her time. Either way, she's a work of pure fiction. Just like Merlin, whom Geoffrey of Monmouth may possibly have based in part on a 6th century Welsh figure called Myrddin Wylot, who was a madman turned prophet living alone in the woods. Yeah, again, all of these characters and stuff, they're probably loosely based on like little histories and stories that might have happened in some little way, and then just insanely embellished over hundreds, thousands of years. We don't know for sure if Myrddin Wylot existed, but if he did, he was no spellcasting wizard, strategic genius, or advisor to the king's court. He was just a hermit who lost the plot and later believed that he could see visions of the future. So, if we reluctantly disregard Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain in 1136 and just about everything that it inspired later, that only really leaves us with Arthur himself. Not the King Arthur of Camelot, but plain old Arthur, mentioned briefly in the 6th century poem The Gododin. Oh yeah, that guy, and fleshed out a little later in the 9th century works, The History of the Britons and the Annals of Wales. His name did very occasionally pop up in other later works around the 9th century, but these references were pretty much just copied wholesale from the latter two. And there are problems with all three of those sources. I'm still quite intrigued by Arthur's first fleeting mention in The Gododin, which alludes to him being the ultimate celebrity warrior, but we can't, or just really into feeding birds, but we can't be absolutely certain that the poem was composed before Arthur became an established hero in the later 9th century chronicles. And even though most historians lean toward the poem being a 6th century piece, the earliest surviving transcription of it hails from the 13th century, and we can't rule out the possibility that the reference to Arthur was a much later addition to the original poem made by a scribe seeking to make it more relevant to a modern audience. Tasked with the same job today, the scribe may have given us a version which read, "He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress. There was no Chuck Norris." Yeah, it just means nothing. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe, but probably not. It's just the whole thing. It's just like, probably not. Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Vanishingly unlikely. We can feel a lot more confident on the dating of the History of the Britons, written as a purportedly genuine historical work by the Welsh monk Nennius at some point around 828, and providing details of all 12 of Arthur's epic battles. Well, It was believed for a long time that Nennius wrote it. Anyway, his preface to the book certainly suggests his authorship, but we have a similar problem here with first editions. The earliest surviving transcription is from over a century later, and some scholars now propose that the preface from Nennius may have been a later forged edition, rendering the true identity of the author or collective authors unknown. But whoever was responsible for putting together the history of the Britons, they certainly had a tendency for stretching credibility. Again, I feel like I've brought it up 1,000 times in today's episode, but it's like, yeah, historians in the past, kind of also fiction authors, they stretch that credibility. They just want to tell a good story. They want to sell a few books. They want to make a few quid. It's all right. While some segments of the Chronicles do contain at least some degree of historical accuracy, there are other segments which drift off into the realms of myth and legend and fairy tale. And I think the mystery authors may have been on the source when they compiled the Chronicles of Arthur, who is made out to be a medieval mashup of the Incredible Hulk, He-Man, and RoboCop. I already thought it sounded a bit iffy when the Chronicles tried to claim that Arthur single-handedly killed 960 enemies during one quiet afternoon. But more suspiciously, these 12 battles are scattered across so many different times and places, all bearing goofy names which have never been proven to represent genuine locations, that it would have been physically impossible for one man to have taken part in all of them unless there was a serious glitch in the Arthur multiverse. The Pseudo-History of the Britons may have been a more fitting title for this work, for the work upon which Geoffrey of Monmouth later drew heavily for his own account of Arthur. Yeah, again, made up history, embellishments, really long time. It's just how it is. We come across yet another potential editing problem with the Annals of History, which leaves us not entirely certain if the references to Arthur weren't just later additions shoehorned into the presumed original text that no longer survives. One interesting point about the Annals of History is that the pages are largely populated with genuine historical figures and events, and if Arthur never existed, then he's a relatively rare, conspicuous exception to this rule, alongside the purely mythological Brutus of Troy. It appears that the bunch of Welsh monks who put together these documents were, by and large, striving for some level of historical accuracy, and were very much of the opinion that Arthur was a real figure. But again, it's an opinion, not a fact. But the issue is we don't really know where they were pulling their information from 300 years after the events they were writing about. It's perfectly plausible that they were largely just pulling it from the pseudo-history of the Britons, written earlier in the same century, under the misguided impression that the information in there was entirely reliable. There were, of course, a few extra insights to be revealed in the Annals of Wales, including the introduction of an early version of Mordred and slightly more specific information on the individual battles. So, could the Welsh monks possibly have obtained these other details from a much more reliable source which has since been lost to the mists of time? Well, we'll never know. But it perhaps, again, it's like, yeah, maybe, but probably not. But perhaps it doesn't inspire too much confidence that their efforts to apply scientific dates to the battles were inconsistent with what we thought we had already learned from the 6th century monk Gildas. And so, in terms of documented historical evidence, we have absolutely zero of the contemporary variety, which is not too surprising as it was the Dark Ages, although his absence from the sermon by Gildas is conspicuous. We get a brief name drop in a subsequent poem, which may or may not have originated from the 6th century, and then we have to wait a couple more centuries to read the works of Welsh chroniclers who may have gone a bit overboard in their efforts to create a new kick-ass Celtic hero. This culminated in the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who turned the kick-ass into a king from sources he refused to disclose, because they didn't exist, and introduced the first sprinkles of fantasy into the story. This is followed up centuries later by the work of French poets who go full on Dungeons and Dragons and conjure up a whole mystical world that never existed, and eventually all of this gets thrown together in a book written by an English bloke who was probably in prison at the time, creating the definitive story of King Arthur. It's just purely ridiculous when you put it like that. Like that 2 paragraphs that I just read, it's like that is why this is ridiculous. In 2 paragraphs. Perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that so many frustrated historians have suggested that we just stop harping on about him altogether, and YouTubers, and skeptical YouTubers. Back in 1977, academic historian David Dunville ventured the opinion, quote, "I think we can dispose of him quite briefly. He owes his place in our history books to a no smoke without fire school of thought. The fact of the matter is there is no historical evidence about Arthur. We must reject him from our histories and above all from the titles of our books." Yeah, the no smoke without fire thing is like, no. Smoke is indicative of a fire, but you might just be looking at steam or someone having a cigarette. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a fire. I feel like 90% of the time that you see smoke, it's not going to be a fire. It's going to be, it's not going to be a problem. It's just going to be like, oh, it could just be steam. Or a car exhaust. It seems as if quite a few people were paying attention to David Dunville, as the situation today seems to have changed quite dramatically. As recently as 2019, writer Brian David observed, quote, "Few topics in late antique and medieval history elicit scholarly groans quite like the idea of a supposedly factual King Arthur. Yet historians and other scholars made cases for Arthur's existence in historic and literary studies up until the 1980s. For academics today, the question of the realism of King Arthur has been largely banished to popular books, video games, and movies," end quote. Yes, where it belongs. So that appears to be settled then. But whilst I'm in complete agreement that King Arthur never existed, I'm not quite ready to give up on the earlier warrior version of Arthur just yet. Okay. Yeah, it was probably a warrior called Arthur at some point. Sure. It's like the Chuck Norris, but he's not the King Arthur. He's not the Round Table. He's not hanging out with Merlin and pulling swords out of stones, is he? What if we just got Arthur's name wrong? Remain in light. One popular theory is that whilst the early heroic deeds of Arthur are completely genuine, we just got a bit confused and credited the wrong man with all of them. The first obvious contender is Ambrosius Aurelianus, who is already name-checked in the contemporary sermon by Gildas. Oh, I don't remember what this dude did. Whilst Geoffrey of Monmouth later suggested that Ambrosius was the uncle of Arthur, oh right, this could have been a complete fabrication which ended up distorting the truth for the following millennium. Whilst we don't know much about Ambrosius beyond the sermon, he's still generally considered to be a real Romanized Briton who fought back against the Saxons in the 6th century. But there's still a little confusion over whether he was likely to have been present at the Battle of Mount Badon, widely regarded as a real, if vague, historical event, or whether he was knocking around a little too early for this, in which case the obvious assumption is that Ambrosius Aurelianus was in fact Arthur's dad who trained up his son to follow fiercely in his footsteps. Sounds a lot more plausible than all that Ultha Pendragon bollocks. Another strong contender is Rathamus, a very real 5th century Briton leader mentioned in multiple contemporary sources, who led troops across the English Channel to fight in Gaul in around 470, just as Arthur was reported to have done by Geoffrey of Monmouth. An intriguing little point here is that after Rathamus was defeated in battle in Gaul, he fled to a little-known territory called Avalon, spelt with an extra L, after which he was never heard of again. And this clearly mirrors the final days of Arthur, in which he supposedly retired to Avalon after getting fatally wounded by his son. Norris J. Lacey, a medievalist and former international president of the International Arthurian Society, reckons that Rathamus is the bloke that we're looking for, as she reckons, quote, "It may be the closest we'll come to locating a specific model for Arthur." Historians are not quite so convinced, though, as the era of Rathamus seems a little too early for Arthur. Yeah, it seems like a solid maybe, but it's just a maybe. And then it's still really far removed from the myths and legends of Arthur. Besides, he doesn't quite seem to be in the same league. The whole point of Arthur is that he triumphed against the odds in several epic battles. Rathamus just travelled to Gaul, got a proper pummeling, and then ran off to Avalon. It's not quite the same, is it? Yeah, he's not like killing 960 men with a sword or whatever, is he? Other popular candidates include a fearless Roman centurion named Lucius Artorius Castus, who also led a campaign in Gaul, albeit far too early for Arthur. A chieftain named Maximus, who had the gift of the gab, a king of Rose in northwestern Wales by the name of Owen Danwyn, and King Alfred the Great, who ruled over the Anglo-Saxons from between 871 to 899, which naturally seems a bit too late. Well, about 400 years too late if we're being pedantic, and he appears to be on the wrong side of the battlefield. We might as well just throw Queen Victoria in there whilst we're at it. I wouldn't have fancied getting on the wrong side of her during a dispute over a spilt pint of lager. And Margaret Thatcher, might as well. Might as well throw in as well. And that actor I'd never heard of. Sure, why not? The list of potential candidates for the real Arthur goes on and on, even if there are serious issues with all of them. But what if Arthur wasn't just one person? What if he was actually an amalgamation of a whole gang of different people through the ages from whom he plucked various characteristics and background stories and achievements? Well, yes, but that's how fiction works. It's not like fictional characters are completely conjured from the imagination without any basis in reality. It's like subconsciously or consciously, you're drawing on different traits from different people and combining them into like one historical, one fictional character for a book. That could potentially explain why it's so difficult to pin Arthur down to one person who may not have shared the same character traits or even lived in the same era. Arthur was instead pieced together from a large cast of prominent people who lived well before his supposed time, such as Roman centurions, and well after his supposed time, like Alfred the Great. On a similar theme, others have suggested that Arthur may have been a title rather than the name of a specific person, bestowed upon the mightiest warrior and passed down through the generations, whatever the current incumbent got his head chopped off or something. When the Godwin poem declared that Guarda, there's that name again, was no Arthur, the author could simply have been suggesting that whilst the guy was pretty handy in a fight, he was no supreme castellan of the empty fist. It's a reference I don't get. They're certainly interesting theories, although it does seem a bit of a shame to strip one potential great man of his name and all his epic achievements. The name is quite important in many ways. It's been proposed that the name is derived from the Celtic word art, which means bear, although this then leads into quite daft theories that Arthur was in fact the human form of a Celtic bear god. Oh my god, people, chill. It's perhaps more likely that the name is simply a Welshed-up version of the traditional Roman name Artorius. But here is a funny thing. We know that there were a few people knocking around with the name Artorius during the 2nd and 3rd century. Then, as we move into the 4th and 5th centuries, the name completely disappears. No Artorius and no Arthur to be found anywhere. Yet the name Arthur suddenly becomes all the rage from the 6th century onwards, and it seems to come packed with prestige as the name is given to Scottish princes and Welsh noblemen. Of course, the absence during the 4th and 5th centuries could just be down to a lack of good record keeping during those periods, but it could be that the name suddenly became quite hip after a certain Arthur created a legacy which transformed it into the inspiring name that sat proudly on top of every new parent's list. It's a bit like all those recent periods in the UK when the popularity of a celebrity triggered a surge in baby names along the lines of Kylie, Britney, Adele, and Boris. People really calling their kids Boris? Like Boris Johnson? Really? From the 6th century onwards, everyone wanted to be a baby artist. Is Boris really Boris Johnson's real name? Boris? It's another point which makes me wonder if there might just be something in this. I'm sorry to everyone called Boris. It's just a weird name, isn't it? It's often argued by more miserable historians that in order for Arthur to exist, too many currently unknown factors would have to be proved to be true, such as any reference to Arthur in documents predating the history of the kings of Britain being of a relatively contemporary nature, rather than later editions after Geoffrey of Monmouth had already crafted the bigger story. But I suppose an optimist could argue that that works the other way too. In order for Arthur to be a complete fabrication, it would be helpful to prove that every single one of those earlier documents was definitely tweaked at some point later. Yes, but if you want to prove something, you have to prove it. It's not on the people who don't believe it's job to disprove it. Doesn't work like that. Professor of Medieval Literature, Raluca Raduscu, doesn't agree with historian David Dunville's dismissal of the no smoke without fire ideology. She says Arthur wouldn't have been fabricated out of thin air. It wouldn't have worked to have bardic poetry that talks about an Arthur if nobody thought that Arthur had been a somebody. We know that the Britons succeeded in holding back the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes in a long string of battles during the 5th and 6th centuries, and it's not outlandish to think that many of these tribes might have been overseen by one great leader of some description who united his men in the defense of Britain and went on to inspire legends for centuries to come. And whilst it's often suggested that Arthur was invented by Welsh chroniclers to create a Celtic warlord for a population in need of an inspiring hero, you do wonder why they didn't go much further with the idea in that case. If Arthur was only a fictional character, then why stop at making him a war leader? They could have gone on to make him a king. Surely this would have been the natural step to elevate the character into a triumphant new beacon of hope and glory, yet it wasn't until the 12th century that Geoffrey of Monmouth gave him a crown to wear. Maybe those Welsh monks really were just more interested in telling the truth as they saw it, rather than conjuring up folklore. Yeah, but those monks, they also wanted that money, didn't they? While the story clearly evolves into pure fantasy by the time we get to the history of the kings of Britain, it's still quite remarkable that Geoffrey of Monmouth chose little old Tintagel as the location of his conception, when the secrets of the village's peculiarly prosperous and potentially powerful past wouldn't be unlocked by archaeologists for another millennium. Did Jeff know something about the history of the largely empty Tintagel that wouldn't have been widely known at the time of writing? Perhaps the reason why the mystery of Arthur still lingers on today is because, quite unlike the rest of his large supporting cast, Arthur has no clear human creator. Yes, Geoffrey of Monmouth was the first to shape the fictional king and weave the fantasy tale that we recognize today. But unless you're working on the assumption that absolutely nothing reliable came before that, then we can't give Jeff the credit for creating Arthur from scratch. He was just building a new world on the foundations of a concept that already existed. Yes, completely agree. Went from something like mildly believable, possibly based on truth, and then just got crazy over time. We can trace the fictional roots of Merlin, Guinevere, Sir Lancelot, and pretty much every other member of the mob to their creator, but we can't do the same for Arthur. And so we never really know for sure where exactly he sprang from. Was it from dried ink on parchment, or from the heat of a very real conflict? One thing we can be sure of is that just about every element of the most widely retold stories is a sack of enchanted horse shit. Did King Arthur and his knights ever go in search of the Holy Grail? No. Did he rule from a round table in Camelot and vanquish his foes with a magical sword? No. Was he ever king at all? Very probably no. Did he spend much of his childhood getting turned into a fish and a badger and a squirrel by a wizard? Well, we'll have to check that one again. Looks like that's a negatory. But did a mighty warrior called Arthur ever lead Britons to triumph in multiple battles against the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes before meeting his end at the Battle of Camelot? Well, maybe. Fierce arguments still rage over whether this Arthur would have been a Celtic warrior or a Romanized Briton, but despite the alleged attempts by Welsh chroniclers to paint him as the former, historians tend to lean toward the latter for several good reasons. Most significantly, Celtic leadership would have been in decline during this period, as a Celtic leader would have been struggling to unite the scattered Britons in the same way as a Romanized Britain. The magnificent triumphs of Arthur's men would also likely have been down to Roman-style strategy, weapons, and fortifications. If the defense of Britain had just boiled down to angry hairy men running randomly around the field with an axe, it's doubtful the Saxons would have been held back for so long. The theory that Arthur may have ended up being formed from an amalgamation of different men is still very plausible, as it would have been impossible for one man to have led the charge across so many battles, across so many years, in so many different places. I kind of like the idea that Arthur is at the very least two men who were father and son. And of course, it is still perfectly possible that the achievements of other great men who came before and after Arthur and son were grafted onto the life story of one man to create a simpler and more compelling narrative. Yes, mainly by that dude in prison who later compiled everything and was like, yeah, here's what we know, and a little bit of made up. Boom, nice narrative. You'll eat this one up. Ultimately, I find myself drawn towards the concept that while King Arthur is most definitely a lie, Arthur himself was a remarkable man from real brutal history upon which legends and dreams were built. And one final point to chew over is that it doesn't really make much difference if Arthur existed or not, as his legacy is set in stone. Arthur helped to shape and define codes of chivalry and conduct and noble behaviour during the Middle Ages, which are still in evidence today, except in Yorkshire. Steady! Arthur became the archetype of strong and wise and fair and brave leadership, and Arthur evolved into a symbol of resistance and unity and hope during wartime and dark periods of political adversity. He also helped to boost tourism in the UK and shift quite a few Cornish pasties here in Tintagel. But the quite astounding point here is that King Arthur might just be a contender for one of the most influential British people to have ever lived, even if he may have never lived at all, and that itself is a pretty epic accomplishment for a largely fictional character who has become immortalized in history, even if it's not remotely accurate history. Long live the once and future king, whoever he is. Or isn't. Yeah, Charlie's worried he's coming back. And that's where we end today's pretty long episode. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. If you want to leave a rating or review, Spotify is the place to go. If you're enjoying this on YouTube, like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.